Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council's Audit and Governance Committee. A warm welcome to all members of the committee, to the officers, and of course to members of the public who may be listening to this live stream. And it was only because of some technical difficulties that we're delayed by a couple of minutes. Going straight into the agenda, could I ask Mr. Hanton from Democratic Services to deal with the housekeeping arrangements, please? Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, everybody. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council's website for a minimum of 6 months. Any councillors or officers not in the room and wishing to speak, please use the raise your hand feature and switch your video and switch on your video when invited to speak. Could members in the room only speak when invited to by the chairman, and also mute your microphones when not speaking. And finally, could members please ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask Mr. Hanton to deal with items 1 and 2 on the agenda, that is apologies and substitute members? Mr. Hanton.
Chairman, we have apologies from one member, Councillor Filer, and then moving to item 2, Councillor Williams has been appointed as a substitute for Councillor Filer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanton. And may I take this opportunity to thank Councillor Williams for filling that casual vacancy, and also to welcome Councillor Howell as a new member of the Audit and Governance Committee. Taking us on to item 3 on the agenda, I will now hand over to the Chairman of the Council, Councillor Hedges, who will take this one item. Councillor Hedges.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. As the current overall Chairman of BCP Council, according to the Constitution, it's my privilege to conduct item 3 of business on the agenda this evening, the election of the Chairman of the Audit and Governance Committee, and according to the Constitution, the person providing, which is me at this time, has a casting vote. Can I call from the committee, please, for nominations to the role of Chairman?
Can I nominate Councillor Beasley?
Thank you, Councillor Williams. You nominate Councillor Beasley. Can I ask if there are any other nominations, and who would second that, please?
I'd second that. Chair,
seconded by Councillor Fear. Thank you. And any other nominations to this role? Councillor Cox.
I'd like to nominate Mark Howell.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. And who would second the nomination of Councillor Mark Howell? Councillor Brooke. Thank you. Are there any more nominations to this role? So in order, if I could ask both nominees to say a few words. Councillor Beasley, if we could start with you, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, I do hope the committee will support me in my nomination as Chairman. I've chaired the Audit and Governance Committee now for the first 3 years of the life of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. And I hope that members will agree that we've made substantial progress in that work, that we've dealt with it in a totally apolitical atmosphere, and that we've achieved most of what we set out to do, and that we've incorporated the input of members, both of the Audit and Governance Committee and the wider Council, for additional items that they would like us to look at, to scrutinise and to make recommendations upon. And for those reasons, I hope that members of the committee can support my nomination. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Beasley. Councillor Howell, I'd like to invite you to say a few words to support your own nomination, if you would, please.
Thank you. Without criticising or meaning to criticise the chair in any way, or the former chair who's standing against me in this election, I do feel that this council is in a very challenging situation at the moment in terms of governance and finances, and it would be good to show to the public that this committee is truly independent of the administration and therefore have a councillor who is not of the same party as the administration chairing it. I've been a councillor for this council and the Borough of Poole for 12 years, unbelievably now. And I've had lots of experience in terms of the Constitution. I am a corporate lawyer, is one of the things that I do. So I've had plenty of experience of dealing with financial organisations, accountancy, audit, and constitutions. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Howell. As there are two nominations to the role of chair of this Audit and Governance Committee, we're now going to proceed to a secret ballot, and I understand the live streaming will be suspended while the secret ballot is conducted. Thank you, Mr. Hanson. Thank you for collecting the slips of the secret ballot, and we've checked the count there, and is for Councillor Beasley there are 5 votes, and for Councillor Howell there are 4 votes. So I declare that Councillor Beasley is the new chairman of Audit and Governance Committee. I'd like to hand over to him and let him have his chair. Very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Hedges, for conducting that part of our agenda. It's much appreciated. And thank you, members of the committee, for re-electing me as chairman of this Audit and Governance Committee. I will continue to do my very best in a neutrally political position. I think we've succeeded in doing that, actually, over the last 3 years, as I said earlier. I fully intend to continue to do so. And indeed, where necessary, to hold the administration to account, supported by both internal and external audit. The other thing I would add is that although you will be aware that we have a very busy forward plan for the remainder of this council, it is my intention that we continue to ask members of this committee, or indeed perhaps still the wider council, for any items they would like to be considered to be put onto future agendas, either for presentation or for more general debate. We've done that and done it successfully on a number of issues that members have brought forward. and I would fully intend to continue doing that. And it would include, of course, the constitution review process, which we will be undertaking and continuing to do until we take those final proposals through to full council towards the end of this calendar year. So no rush for any of that, but please email me if there are any particular issues and your reasons for wanting them to be considered. And I will give that the kind of consideration I have done right the way through up until now. Taking us on to item 4 on the agenda, the election of Vice Chairman. Are there any nominations? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to nominate Councillor Lawrence Fear.
And are there any seconder? Is there a seconder?
I'd like to second that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butt. Are there any other nominations? Councillor Howell.
I'd like to nominate Councillor Brooke.
Seconder. And Councillor Cox. Are there any other nominations? In that case, we have 2 nominations. Mr. Hanton, could you conduct a secret ballot again for this position? the outcome of item 4 on the agenda, which is the election of vice chairman, is that Councillor Fear has been so elected on my casting vote.
Thank you, Chairman.
Takes us to item 5 on the agenda, which is declarations of interest. Mr. Hampton.
May I invite any members with interest to make their declaration now?
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. This is mainly for transparency. I may not have to declare it, but I am doing. There's reference in the risk register to issues relating to hosting Ukrainian families, and we are currently a host for a Ukrainian family.
Thank you. Understood. Councillor Cox.
And I'll declare the fact that I own and run a firm of chartered accountants and auditors, and on the basis that we're talking about the auditors.
Councillor Cox. Don't appear to be any others. Thank you, members. Takes us to item 6 on the agenda, which is confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of April 2022. Are you agreed that those are a true and accurate record of that meeting? Councillor Cox.
I'm afraid I do have a problem with the minutes. Just bear with me a second. It's in relation to the discussions we had in terms of the audit. I didn't, and that's line 105. I'm afraid I have to say I don't feel as though that particularly reflected the discussions that we had. The discussions that we had went much deeper and far more critical of the position that we were in than appears to be the case. That point to be made.
Care to elaborate any further, or would you prefer to elaborate when we get to that item on the agenda this evening?
I'll just talk about it later on. Yeah, I'm just making the point that I do feel that that particular point we and I know Councillor Phipps was very vocal about this particular matter, and I don't feel as though that's properly reflected in the minutes, and certainly there was one particular bit in there which I know has been reflected about the fact that we should be considering having a qualified opinion. That has been reflected, but I don't think it was given due relevance, and I just felt from a minutes perspective it wasn't, the emphasis wasn't there, so I just wanted to make a point.
Well, I appreciate that and respect your difference. My suggestion is that we leave them as they are, that we deal with that item in the context of the email that's been already distributed from Grant Thornton in preparation for this evening, and that perhaps in minuting that item this evening, you can make those points and they will be duly reflected in today's minute. Does that satisfy you, Councillor Cox? Thank you. Councillor Howell.
Just like it to be noted that I'm not in a position to approve the minutes, having not been.
With the exception of Councillor Howell, therefore, are you agreed? Thank you very much, members. Takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is public issues, and I'll pass back to Mr. Hampton from Democratic Services. Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Chairman. There are 3 public questions and 1 public statement, and I'm going to read out the questions, and the responses are going to be given by the Chairman. Public question 1. Agenda item 16, issue 5 in the draft annual governance statement, AGS, for 2021/22 regarding the Council's substantially inadequate fixed asset accounting records. Question. Prior to approving the AGS narrative, has this overseeing committee been made aware of the adverse impact concerning the disconnection between prime entry accounting records and the spreadsheet registers utilised to compile the balance sheet fixed asset figures of material monetary total?
And the response is, there is no disconnection the prime entry accounting records, which we're assuming is a reference to Technology Forge not holding revaluation figures. A reconciliation is carried out to ensure assets held on Technology Forge are also within the spreadsheet of the asset register.
Consequent misstatements in the related balance sheet amounts.
And the response is, misstatement in balance sheet amounts identified by external auditors are in relation to the valuation basis, which is outside the issue raised. Misstatement in balance sheet amounts were in relation to the basis of specific asset valuations identified by external audit during their work, not to do with any reconciliation or disconnection between records.
Associated loss of accounting and audit trail entailing impediments to the directional verification of individual fixed assets in terms of original transaction amounts and physical existence of assets.
And the response is, the key reconciliation is to ensure assets on both data sources are captured. Physical existence of assets is part of the external auditor testing.
As the new system starts 1/4/23 earliest, what realistic confidence level can be placed reconciliation-wise in the interim Technology Forge systems and other controls?
And the response is, it is a reconciliation that has been acknowledged by external auditors as being an effective control. Internal audit have also noted the controls as being effective, albeit inefficiently consuming a scarce staff resource, and consequently this efficiency gain is a main driver for transformational work.
Philip Gattrell, 21/7/22. Public question 2. Agenda item 16, issue 5 in draft AGS for 2021/22 and contravention of law regarding regulations 3, 4, 5 and 6 of Accounts and Audit Regulations 2015, brackets 2015 regulations, close brackets, and monitoring officers' obligatory reporting duty under the Local Government and Housing Act 1989, brackets 1989 Act. Question. Has this regulatory committee been aware of the following factors that accompany consideration of the AGS? The related contravention of, in particular, 2015 Regulation 4, now requiring the MO's explanatory report to all members under the 1989 Act. Wrongful admission of the issue from BCPC's first AGS for 2019/20, although undoubtedly already identified by those concerned.
And the response is, the issue was not wrongfully omitted from the 2019-2020 annual governance statement. Items included on the AGS are always a matter of judgment. The AGS is part of the statement of accounts, which was fully audited.
Details of the total monetary differences arising on the fixed assets reconciliations performed. What are those amounts?
And the response is, the total monetary difference arising on the fixed assets reconciliation performed is 0.
The directly related amount of KPMG's fees, which, although described in the AGS as finance transformation, also represents part penalty costs for existing system failures.
And the response is, we are unable to separate the costs for individual finance modules which KPMG are assisting the Council to implement.
Philip Gattrell, 21/7/22. Public question 3. Agenda item 16, incorrect omission of significant issue from draft AGS 2021/22 regarding the proven contravention of regulations 15 brackets 3 of local authorities, members' allowances, England regulations 2003 relating to council's substantially incorrect published information for 2019/20 and 2020/21. Question. Will the committee ensure that this issue is incorporated in the 2021/22 brackets and 2020/21 close brackets draft AGSs, given the gravity of such non-compliance was accepted in the MO's response at your meeting 3/2/22, following my further detailed notification of contravention. Council's forensic examination evidences the originally published substantial errors in allowances, payments, amounts and categories. The recently revised and published information does not substitute for inclusion in the AGS and obligatory reporting by the MO under the 1989 Act. Notwithstanding the MO's email to me 8/7/22 expressing untenable uncertainty regarding reporting at all, bearing in mind also the Act does not permit exemption.
And the response, which is reasonably lengthy, is as follows. The errors brought to the Council's attention by Mr Gattrell in connection with the publication of members' allowances data for the 2019-2020 and the 2020-2021 financial years have been addressed and rectified by the Council. These were administrative and minor in nature and did not result in any significant cost or loss to the Council. The amended information was published and includes a narrative to state what changes have been made and why. It is the view of the monitoring officer that this matter falls below the threshold to trigger a report under Section 5 of the Local Government and Housing Act 1989. Regulation 6(4)(b) of the Accounts and Audit Regulations require the annual governance statement to be prepared. The guidance and framework issued by SIPFA and SOLIS make it clear that in relation to any governance issues, the AGS should only contain actions taken or proposed to deal with significant governance issues. In particular, the AGS is intended to be a high-level, strategic and brief communication. It should only contain significant governance issues which have been addressed or which are proposed to be addressed in the coming year. If I understand Mr Gattrell's question correctly, he is querying why the non-issue of a Section 5 LGHA 1989 report by the monitoring officer was not reported in the AGS. This is because the monitoring officer has fulfilled her statutory duty in determining the matter as set out above. And I will ask Democratic Services and or the monitoring officer to ensure that Mr Gattrell has these responses to his questions emailed to him at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Chairman. Just one more public issue, which is a public statement, which I can read out. Constructive observations within constraints of permitted 100 words regarding Council's continuing failures in delivering effective accountability and adequate performance. With reference to the preceding public questions reflecting monitoring officer, (MO), non-compliance with sections 5 and 5A, section 5 and section 5A, close brackets, of the 1989 Act. Public statement. Section 5 and section 5A stipulate Council regulation by 3 officers, MO, CEO and section 151. MO's compulsory duty is to report to each member actual and potential contraventions of law and events of maladministration, though viewed abain by MOs where contraventions considered trivial. MO's reporting omissions, where triviality does not apply, go unbridled when CEO and section 151 officer are not engaged as triumvirs. Ultimately, compounded by Council failures in independent judgment if submitting to officers' defective advice, despite notice of manifest major breaches, viz. My notifications to officers and councillors alike. Example, MO's documented rejection of section 5A, (5) reporting obligation to all members, not only to Cabinet. Philip Gattrell, 25/7/22. And Chairman, that completes the public issues.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hampton. Councillor Howell.
Thank you, Chair. Am I entitled to ask for some clarification on a response, because I was surprised about a statement in one of those responses to the questions?
We would normally not do so because we're answering public questions and reading out a public statement. I will ask Ms Seiss, the Monitoring Officer, for guidance. Ms Seiss.
Thank you, Chairman. Ordinarily, there isn't a debate on questions and statements, but as I suspect Councillor Howell might be wanting to question one of the questions or statements about me, it might be better for another officer to give that advice, Chairman.
Mr Hampton, would you like to be that other officer?
Thank you. Well, Chairman, I can only quote the Constitution, which prohibits debate or discussion on public issues.
So I think the brief answer, Councillor Howell, is that the answer is no. However, what we do try to do on audit and governance is between meetings to follow up on issues. So I think it might be helpful if whatever that is, you could commit to writing in an email, which I'd like you to copy to me, or indeed if you want to all members of the committee, and we'll get a response for you soonest.
Yes, or there might be an opportunity later in the meeting to raise the point, but I'd just like to make it clear it wasn't anything to do with the monitoring officer.
Right, but that opportunity of emailing outside of the meeting is always open to any member of this committee. That takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Monitoring Report, which will be presented by Matt Filmer, who's the Assistant Chief Financial Officer. And I may ask Mr Richards if he needs to add anything once that presentation has taken place. So over to you, Mr Filmer.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Audit and Governance Committee. So the report starts with the usual economic update, and it cites the most recent increase in the bank rate, which currently stands at 1.25%. And there's a high expectation in the markets that this will increase again this time next week, potentially by another 0.5%. And you'll see on table 1 of our report, it sets out our Treasury Management Advisor's forecast for interest rates, and they expect interest rates to peak at 2.75% in the medium term. Now, the increase by the Bank of England is an effort to try and stem growing inflation, which I'm sure all committee members are aware of. And the latest inflationary figure for June for CPI was 9.4% year on year, well above the Bank of England's target of 2%. And the Bank of England themselves are expecting inflation to peak around 11% within the next few months. So for the Council, this means that borrowing costs will increase as interest rates increase, but it also means that we can earn higher investment income on our investment balances. So the report then goes on to set out the outturn position for 21-22, and you'll see on table 2, this sets out the Treasury Management Function budget, which ended the year with an underspend of 745,000, which was due to being able to access historically low borrowing and also having much higher cash balances than we expected coming into that financial year. Table 3 of the report sets out the final external borrowing position of the Council, which sat at 257 million, and that reflects some of the new PWLB borrowing that we took out during the financial year. Now, table 4 is a new inclusion to the Treasury Management Report, and this sets out the Council's total debt position, known as the capital financing requirement. It's something that we picked up at last month's training that I delivered for members, and the total capital financing requirement as at the end of March for the Council was 477 million. And table 5 sets out the final investment balance, which was just under 150 million. And then the report goes on to give an update for Q1 for 22-23, and we're currently forecasting an underspend of 840,000, and that's principally because of investment income. Not only have interest rates increased much quicker than we expected, but our cash balances are much higher. We're still holding a large amount of government grants, and those committee members may be aware that we also had to distribute £150 at the beginning of the year for support on energy bills. There's been no new external borrowing for the first quarter, and investments at the end of June stood at just over 108 million. Now, the report goes on to update members of the changing regulations that affect Treasury management activity, and that's set out in paragraphs 25 to 28. And it sets out some of the central government's proposals as part of the Levelling Up bill to stop councils continuing to take on excessive risk and non-compliance with frameworks. And this is mostly around where councils have been investing in commercial assets or borrowing in advance of need. And part of the action that's proposed in that bill from government may lead to externally imposed debt caps on councils and potentially forcing direct asset sales, so potentially forcing councils to disinvest from any commercial properties after the guidance was issued. Now, the last part of the report seeks approval from this committee to increase the council's debt threshold, which is set within the council's prudential indicators and is approved by full council in part of the budget setting in February. Now, you may remember back in September last year, it was agreed to increase the council debt threshold from 457 million to 855 million. And that was on the premise that services continue to invest in services, but also help support the big plan agenda, seeing significant investment in regeneration and delivery of housing. So this move to 855 million put us at the midpoint in terms of a benchmarking exercise across all upper tier local authorities. Now, as at the end of March 2022, all that available headroom has now been committed up to the 855 million, which includes decisions around significant areas such as the future funds pot of 50 million, the Carter's Quay development at 46 million, and significant investment in new build housing across the housing revenue account and the general fund. And those commitments are set out in Appendix 2 to this report. So the proposal is to increase the debt threshold to 1.3 billion, and that's set out in Table 9, which will move the council to the top of the third quarter compared to other upper tier local authorities. And that benchmarking is illustrated in Appendix 1 to this report. So the increase in the headroom will allow further delivery of housing schemes and housing support schemes, but also allow BCP Futures Places and Bournemouth Development Company to progress. So the increase proposal is on a new premise that no further borrowing will be undertaken, which is not supported by a self-funding business case. So effectively avoiding the need for debt servicing costs to be added to the general fund budget. And paragraph 35 of the report sets out the Chief Financial Officer's view of this proposal. So I'll stop there, Chair, and happily take any questions.
Richards, Chief Financial Officer, and then I'll go back to Mr. Fulmer for any questions to him.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And just to highlight that I will be focusing particularly on recommendation 4, which is the recommendation to council to revise the potential indicators and to increase the council's debt threshold to £1.334 billion. The proposal in front of you tonight is very much around enabling service-based capital expenditure to be financed from debt with the cost spread over the time period that we expect to benefit from that expenditure. It is also designed to support the big plan objective, including the delivery of regeneration and housing business cases, which will provide an ongoing resource base for the authority as a minimum once the borrowing is repaid. As Mr. Filmer has pointed out, I would like to just re-draw your attention to section 34 of the report, because within section 34, what it says is almost that this increase is conditional on no further commitments to debt being taken on, which would require the general fund budget of the council to finance the revenue implications of taking on that additional debt. What I would also like to highlight is that tonight you are giving us out that flexibility. You are not agreeing to any specific schemes that would utilise that debt flexibility. They will be based on separate business cases that should be strong, robust and affordable, that would be brought forward for Cabinet and Council approval in due course. Chair, happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richards. Members, questions either for Mr. Filmer or indeed for Mr. Richards. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad, I'm grateful for the section 151 officer to highlight paragraph 34, because that's the paragraph I highlighted as well. And one question I do want to know is if we're getting that commitment now that none of this will happen going forward, how much of it happened going back? How much debt have we got into, which has caused a burden on the taxpayer?
Richards.
Chair, if I can refer members to Appendix 2. At the bottom of Appendix 2, you have a number of commitments that the Council has previously undertaken, which create a financial liability that the Council would need to budget for as part of its general fund revenue budget. One of those, and probably the most principal one of those, is the Futures Fund. We also have the £10 million that we've invested in SEND capital with the aim of creating additional school places for special educational needs pupils. And we also have the Green Futures Funds. Those are the three principal areas where the Council made a decision to, if you like, budget for those revenue implications rather than them being supported by the business cases themselves.
I assume that you also are including the Festival Coast Live, the cleaner, greener, safer, and the highways maintenance as well.
I am not at this moment in time including those. If they are specific debts you're referring to in Appendix 2,
yeah, they're in that expenditure too.
Then those would principally be funded from the business cases themselves.
Cox, did you want to come back?
Yeah, no, not particularly on that. I appreciate the response. Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to do two things at once. Okay. The problem I have with this, and I understand the Chief Financial Officer's opinion that this gives the Council greater flexibility. The problem I have with it is it may well give the Council greater flexibility. It also gives the administration greater flexibility, and that's the problem I have with it. Is that, in my opinion, the administration have acted. What's the word? In an unconservative way, and have splashed the cash, and therefore I cannot support any increase in the debt under this current administration.
Do you have any further questions, Councillor Cox? Councillor Howell.
Thank you. I have, well, my first question, a couple I think, is in relation to the current, as we understand it, negotiation between the administration, council and the government in regard to a £50 million loan in order to stop the council from either going bust next year or having to cut massively back its services because of the apparent inability of the council to fit the beach hut scheme into the flexible use of capital receipts scheme. So because of the general nature of that kind of the savings made under transformation, wouldn't any savings, any payments of interest for loans like that come out of the general fund? And it indeed is when the the Chief Financial Officer was making his statement, was he anticipating and including, you know, the amount of this loan in the figures that we're talking about now? Perhaps he'd like to answer before I go on to the second question. He'd like to.
Mr. Richards.
Thank you, and an interesting question, in the sense that, you know, when the report was written and prepared, it was clearly based on the borrowing arrangements that we would traditionally expect a local authority to face with regards to the requirement to produce robust business cases to support any additional council borrowing. I think the councillor quite rightly points out that, to the best of my knowledge, if the council were to be given a capitalisation direction, that would be scored as borrowing, because we would undertake borrowing directly from PWRB, and that borrowing would need to be something that is factored into the overall borrowing arrangements of the council. But what we have to recognise is that in that situation, the borrowing would be funding the council's transformation programme, and there is a very strong business case associated with that transformation programme with regards to, I think, a less than 18-month payback. So I think it would still be consistent with the condition that is within section 34 of this report, because it would require that strong business case, which has already been signed off by full council to some extent.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. And Councillor Howell, your second question.
Yes, I mean, given the large or relatively large increase in interest rates in the USA, and the forecast of further large increases, which will no doubt inevitably result in similar increases on this side of the Atlantic, how does the council anticipate and look forward to Jeff talked also about this £50 million loan, which I understand will have an extra 1% interest on it on top of the normal Public Works Loan Board rate. So we've got potentially, looking forward at these future projects, looking forward at these projects, we have increasing borrowing costs. So I'd like to understand, as projects are being developed and council funds and resources are being put into projects being developed, how at the same time they are being kind of budgeted against projected increased interest rates, and whether there are mechanisms which start to say, you know, this project's no longer viable and we need to scale back or potentially stop these projects. So I'd like to understand, you know, the internal workings of that process, please.
Mr. Richards.
And thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. I think it's fair to say that many officers are probably in a position where undertaking day-to-day activity within such a inflationary climate as we have at this moment in time is something new to them. So we are potentially having to consider issues that perhaps we haven't had to consider for quite a considerable period of time. When it comes to business cases being put forward to Cabinet and Council for approval to utilise debt, what we always do is use the current prevailing rate and a higher rate that reflects almost a minimum risk level rate that we think would be appropriate to the project. So we understand the kind of interest rate exposure we are potentially taking on those projects. In addition, and I think it's probably something that we are requiring more of with regards to projects coming forward, we are requesting officers in putting forward business cases to consider the adequacy of any contingency depending on the nature of the project that's being put forward and the extent to which that might be influenced by movements in the prices of the relevant materials for that project. The other aspect of responding to the question is also to recognise that from a Treasury management team, from a Treasury management point of view, Matt and his team clearly have to consider when is the right time for the council to borrow for projects rather than actually borrowing on the day that we need to. And I think it's fair to say that last year we undertook some considerable borrowing at a rate just below 1.6% on a fixed term basis for quite a considerable number of years. And that's the art at Treasury management about managing that cash flows and taking the borrowing at the appropriate point in time. But I think the question is a fair one, and I think it will be something that all senior officers and the corporate management team will need to keep under constant review as we go forward, because clearly these are unusual times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richards. Councillor Cox.
Thanks. In terms of the, it was interesting what you had to say about your paragraph 34 and the potential new loan scheme to replace the Beach Hut saga. But what I don't understand is, from your answer, Adam, is that if the transformation payback is so good, why are we not doing it now? Why did we do it last year? If the payback is so good for the transformational, we should have started it months ago, if not years ago. If the council administration is that confident in doing what they say they're going to do, why haven't we started it? Why haven't we started it ages ago? I'd remind the councillors that actually we had a transformational budget last year which failed to deliver the savings that it promised by some quite considerable margin. And so, you know, I have, I'm afraid, little or no confidence that the payback will be in 18 months. So I'd like to know why is it not started now?
Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And just to emphasise, you know, we are now in the third year of our transformation programme, so it has started, and a considerable amount of momentum is beginning to build in regards to that programme. And we saw some savings last year, and I think, as we will reference later in the paper, we've seen some significant savings delivered in year with regards to that transformation programme. You know, what we clearly have an issue around that the transformation programme expenditure is mainly of a revenue nature, and you cannot normally borrow to fund revenue expenditure, and therefore that is in essence the issue that we're trying to resolve with regards to the funding of that programme.
Leader of the Council, Councillor Mellor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And if it helps, just to explain a little bit further as the portfolio holder for transformation. The transformation programme we've got in front of us is very much similar to the programme that full council signed off under the previous administration, Unity Alliance, when Vicky Slade was the portfolio holder for transformation. So, and particularly the timescale around when we were and the process to be onboarding the SIP, our strategic implementation partner, was exactly the same. So the timescale effectively has been set by your group leader, Councillor Cox. And what we're now doing is we've effectively extended the ambition of it in terms of trying to make sure there's more money to be invested in it. As you'll see in the MTFP, we are stretching what we expect to gain from it, but effectively the timetable has been set by your previous administration. The last point as well, you talked about the success of we had a transformation budget last year. Just perhaps talk members through that. So initially the MTFP we inherited when we became an administration was there was a £15 million target for transformation savings, which were largely to do with people savings. So effectively the previous administration were going to take £15 million of cost out of the organisation before we'd actually done any of the transformation work and put the other systems in place. What we did in our budget, we reduced that target to 7.5 million. We don't believe that you should take cost out of an organisation before you've done the work there, and then subsequently through the year We didn't, we've delivered a significantly better than balanced budget, so we didn't need to stress the organisation for those full 7.5 million savings. So we reduced it to in the region of about 2.5 million. So it was the only option the previous administration had. We halved it, and then we deliberately took it back down to 2.5 million. And it's also worth in terms of the success of transformation and our LGR journey. I do remember the budget report we took to council in February. It highlighted that effectively we'd already delivered about £50 million a year of recurring savings since 2019, so 47 point something. So we've got a timescale that was effectively under the last Liberal Democrat administration. We've got a programme that is delivering, has delivered, and is on track to continue to deliver. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I welcome the leader to, I think, what is his first audit and governance meeting? I think, despite the fact that this is actually his subject. So I'd just like to correct him on a few things. It wasn't a Liberal Democrat administration; it was a Unity Alliance administration. Although obviously we're working towards that. And I note the fact that he seems to claim that he wasn't stressing the organisation by almost deliberately reducing the savings target from 7.5 million to 2.5 million. Not needing to stress the organisation basically means failing. That's a new way of saying failing, I'm afraid. So he has failed to do the transformational savings in the year in which he was in charge, and that's why I have zero confidence that he's going to deliver the transformational savings that he's promising left, right and centre, like he's failed to deliver the beach shots saga scheme so far. And he's now having to go cap in hand to the government to rescue it. Thank you.
Well, without straying into political territory, and you know very well, Councillor Cox, that I won't allow that to happen. I think one or two members have pushed that boundary this evening already, but I will go back to the Leader of the Council to respond to the points that you've just made. After that, I have Councillor Brooke, and I believe I've got Councillor Bartlett online as well, but I'll come to Councillor Bartlett or anybody else online after I've gone to members here on the committee. Councillor Mellor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll try very hard not to be political. Just a couple of points of clarification so one, this isn't my first Audit and Governance Committee. I've been here. It might not have been a Liberal Democrat administration, but transformation was led by a Liberal Democrat in Vicky Slade. So this is the timescale set by your party, Councillor Cox. A couple of things in terms of failing. I've really taken a bit of umbrage at the failing to deliver effectively. The process was really quite clear. How we moved from 7.5 million to 2.5 million. Every single one of those potential savings would have gone through CMB. And how that process works is portfolio holders are alongside those decisions and those recommendations, and effectively CMB and Cabinet decided throughout that not to take those savings, as we didn't need to. We clearly didn't need to. And then you're on record as congratulating us on how we delivered a more than balanced but better budget last year. Lastly, Chair, just another point of clarification. What we bring forward in terms of our funding of transformation, we are in the process of bringing forward and discussing with ministers. We were called into a discussion with those ministers, with previous ministers, around future funding of local government because of our track record in delivering back-to-back council tax freezes, and the effectively how transformation is a massive part of the solution across local government, and we're at the vanguard of that, and we're an exemplar authority in that. And in terms of the Beach Hut project, we now in DLUC actually have confirmed that it falls absolutely within the current regulations, as did SIPFA, as did our external auditors Grant Thornton. So if we can negotiate something that is even stronger for this council and puts us on a path to be put on as an exemplar authority for back-to-back council tax freezes and strong transformation, then I'll proudly stand in front of that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mellor. Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a number of points. So can you bear with me?
How would you like to do them? Do you want to do them all together, and are they for Mr. Richards, or are they for Mr. Filmer?
Oh, Mr. Richards and Mr. Filmer, but I'll deal with the first bit first, which is from paragraph 26, looking at the new levelling up and regeneration bill. Some of the set metrics that are being asked about for us to be able to reduce or moderate risk. Is the first one, proportionality of debt compared to the financial resources at the disposal of the authority. We have on numerous occasions been told that, oh, well, we're right in the middle, and there are matters of other councils with the same levels of debt. I'm not interested particularly in the level of debt. What I am interested in is that word proportionality, which relates to the amount of financial resources available to the authority. And have we, when we've looked at these other authorities with similar debt and saying exactly that for being at the top of the third quarter, you can see a number of authorities that are about the same level of debt. Are they at the same, do they have the same level of financial resources, or do they have far better financial resources available to them, or are they worse off? It's important that we know that, because clearly if our financial resources are way below the groups we're comparing with, then we're in a rather serious position. So that's the first question.
I think we'll take that one on its own to start with, and I'll go to Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair, I refer the councillor to Appendix 1, which is the benchmarking of the council's capital financing requirement, because we start off by looking in absolute terms. But then what we do is we convert it to that proportionality aspect by looking at its relationship to the council's net revenue expenditure. You know, and that is a technique that SIPA advocate with regards to considering and taking account of the size of the authority and the resources at its disposal. So when we've made the decision to, first of all, move up to the midpoint and then move to the top of the third quartile, we are benchmarking that in relation to the council's and every other council's net revenue expenditure, so that it is all proportional on that basis. So that does take account of the issue that the councillor raises.
Councillor Brooke, your next question.
I've got to click back to it. In the same set of metrics, it just says whether the authority is meeting its statutory duty to make sufficient provision for debt repayment. I'm assuming that this also includes the amount of money being set aside in reserves and unearmarked reserves, with the very small amounts being put aside in the current budget. Is the 151 officer happy that we are making sufficient provision for debt repayment?
Yeah, just to clarify, you know, that reference within that matrix is regards to, are we making sufficient provision for debt repayment as required by local authority accounting practice? And I'm sure if we weren't, then the auditor would be highlighting it as part of our statement of account. So I confirm that that matrix relates to the provision of debt repayment, and that you know, that the council is doing that. And if it wasn't, it would be a matter that the auditors would be bringing forward to this committee for its attention.
Councillor Brooke.
Can I just come back on that slightly? Thank you, Adam, for your response. But you have said on numerous occasions the council is spending beyond its means. What effect does that actually have in terms of the debt repayment?
Richards.
Well, I think the reference is the fact that, as you said, that within the budget report, you know, I've clearly indicated that the council's expenditure level is greater than the permanent sources of funding coming in. So therefore, going forward, the council would need to make decisions to actually bring those two into a line. I think the emphasis for tonight is the fact that, as I said earlier, you are giving yourselves that flexibility to extend your overall debt ceiling. You are not utilising that. That utilisation will be based on a strong, robust business case that will be brought forward, you know, and actually you would expect that business case to take account of that conditional element factored into section 34 of this report. And hopefully, you know, that provides you with a level of assurance that you need.
Councillor Brooke.
It could do, but it equally doesn't, bearing in mind that the current headroom has already been used up in planning right through to 2027. So it's likely that the headroom is going to be reduced considerably if we approve the increase. Can I ask a question, Chair, related to the big plan? Because what concerns me, and I may be wrong in this, maybe I'm not aware of what course the big plan has gone through in terms of council, but I'm not aware of it having come to council at all, and I'm not aware of it having gone through overview and scrutiny in the past. And yet it is being used for virtually everything within the council. And I don't understand how, in terms of governance, something like that, as important as the big plan, can not go through scrutiny and not go through full council, and yet form the basis for basically every large decision and for a large amount of the debt that we are currently incurring.
Richards or the Chief Executive?
Thank you, Chief Executive. Thank you, Chairman. Just happy to pick that one up. The big plan is a strategic document. It sets out the council's sort of overall direction. I think the reassurance you've had from Mr. Richards is that any one of these projects coming forward would be considered in its own merit. So whilst the big plan provides a context, it isn't a spending plan that's got specific project approvals within it. We do each of those projects separately. The big plan helps to set the context for us.
Brooke?
But as a strategic document, surely it should have been scrutinised and gone through full council as well before actually being accepted and worked with. I mean, it's impacting on the local plan and all sorts of issues.
I think the answer I'd have to give was it could be agreed through the council. It creates a framework, but it doesn't set decisions for us. Those decisions are all taken independently. So my sense is that the big plan gives us a framework to work within. It's effectively the administration's overall direction, but it isn't a binding document. It hasn't been confirmed by council as those are the words that we use, but it gives us a sense of direction for the administration.
Next question, Councillor Brooke.
I think that is probably it for this paper. I'll leave it at that, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Phipps.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, Councillor Brooke has just come up with a question I was going to ask. When did this big plan go through council? That's exactly what I was going to say. And as far as I'm concerned, in governance terms, there's something very, very wrong. That's my opinion on that. This council was never asked if actually this is the framework, I think that's the word you just used, that we actually wanted for this council, to take this council forward in this way and actually to incur all this debt. So thank you for raising that, because I was going to actually do that as well. So whether the Chief Executive wants to say any more on that, I don't know. It seems to me from, well, I know from, we had some Treasury training, which I attended, and apparently money, the money that you get from government comes from the Public Loans Board or something like that, the PWL board. And they specifically do not want councils to take risks with the money that they are giving out. That's what we were told. And it seems to me there are certain things you can spend this money on and certain things that you can't. And all it seems to me that we seem to have done with this money that we're requesting, up to over £1 billion, is relabeled it somehow. So, oh no, it's not a risk, it's okay, it's regeneration, it's this, it's that and the other. And so in order to meet the criteria, to me, there's something very, very wrong. This just isn't right. And I'd like to be assured, please, that there is no risk, actually, because I would have thought that you would have had to have assured the government who are lending this money that there is no risk. So has that been done? And can you assure us there's no risk? Something else I'd just like to comment on, if that's all right, and there may be a question come out of it. We've heard about what was inherited by the administration. And I'd just like to point out that actually this administration inherited a debt threshold of £475 million, which has been put up already to 855 million, which we've heard has already been committed. That's gone. And now we're trying to go even more, 1.3 billion. So surely there has to be some sort of clear business case for these schemes to cover this additional debt. Or how do we know we won't be needing even more debt if something goes wrong? And I think I've heard this right, that these schemes are going to be considered on their own merit individually. But have they got each one already got a business case? So can we see that there's no risk? There is no, I can't see there's any guarantee that these schemes actually aren't risky. I don't like it at all. We're asked to endorse it at number 3, endorse the borrowing. It's not only noting, it's endorsing paragraphs 25 to 35. And at 4, recommendation 4, we're asked to approve and recommend to council this borrowing, the revised prudential indicators. Well, I can't support either of those. So I hope that you're going to do them separately, because I wouldn't be able to support this paper at all otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Phipps. I'm going to ask Mr. Richards to deal with the generality of some of the issues you raised, because they are they were quite wide-ranging, and then I'll go back to the Leader of the Council, because I think he would like to fill in some of those gaps for you as well. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And just to emphasise, tonight what you're doing is giving yourself the flexibility to bring forward strong, robust business cases for individual schemes at a future point in time. And those business cases would need to come through in line with our governance framework to Cabinet and Council for full approval as part of that process. As part of those business cases, you would expect them to set out the potential financial liabilities associated with these schemes, the risks you're taking as part of those schemes, and to provide you with reassurance that ultimately those schemes are affordable.
Leader of the Council, Councillor Mellor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to this in a bit more detail. I think it's worth just taking a sort of a calm step back here. We're looking at this very much, or considering it, the comments from the committee so far as ability to increase borrowing. What we're actually doing, what Mr. Filmer was very clear about in his introduction, was the line that said that no further no borrowing could be valued as a strong business case. And he also said it's very clear on what we are able to borrow for, as I believe you would have seen in the training the committee undertook recently. And he said it's regeneration and housing, effectively. So what we've done, and hopefully this does provide you some comfort, Councillor Phipps, but you talk about the cap already being increased and what we inherited. So what we've done, and what we want to do is we want to increase the asset base for future generations, and that's what we've done. So, and again, I believe this was in Mr. Filmer's introduction. There's 160 new homes in Hamworthy. We've done that this year. The large scale increase in Racina's programme, which has effectively mean us purchasing a significant amount more housing and building a lot more housing. So we have moved on the debt threshold that we inherited, but we've also massively connected that to the assets that sit next to that. And to take comfort from, no further borrowing will be there unless there's a very strong business case. So as things move forward, full council, overview and scrutiny committee will have the opportunity to look at, interrogate, get alongside, or reject effectively. So to be clear, we are looking at ability to increase our asset base. And if you look at what we can generally do is in terms of housing, it's largely what we can spend the money on. An asset of a house, very rarely does that asset decrease in value. So is it a low risk asset? Absolutely, of course housing is. Is it needed by people in our communities? Yes, absolutely is. What does happen over time is that asset typically goes up. and while the borrowing is paid off. So if you actually look at the transaction, what we're delivering for future generations is significantly stronger asset base, low risk, strong asset base for future generations to inherit, whilst also this current generation having the ability to move into homes and local homes for local people. So if anybody in this room is positive about housing delivery, you should be positive about giving us the opportunity to invest further in housing, which is what we're doing because our population needs it, and also we will be delivering a significantly materially improved balance sheet to future generations. I hope that gives you some assurance, Councillor Phipps.
Thank you, Councillor Mellor. Did you want to come back, Councillor Phipps, or can I move on?
Just very briefly, really. I listened to all of that. Okay, I can't say I'm totally convinced, and I just think that this council should be living within its means and not borrowing like this. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Councillor Howell.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I mean, the leader talks as if the Carter's Key scheme is up and running and delivering income, when in fact, as I know to my cost, because it's banging away constantly, they're just putting the piling in at the moment. It remains to be seen, whether that housing will be will deliver. And many people, including myself, felt that we paid too much for that site, and that's going to hamper our ability to make it viable. But what I was moving on to say is that we're in a situation where, the house prices are going crazy at the moment. Everything is showing the signs of the end of the bubble, imminent crash. And when the next financial crisis happens, it is going to be bigger than 2008, and we have fewer resources as a nation to be able to deal with it. And I'm just very uncomfortable with us entering into schemes that are not forensically examined, and that we are confident that are going to really deliver in terms of need for the population, and deliver in terms of council afloat financially. And the more that we inflate the borrowing, the harder it is as an organisation to keep tabs and make those business cases substantial and accurate enough, and to deliver confidence to councillors and to the public. So yeah, it does worry me greatly that we're essentially giving license to an administration to spend money which it has already demonstrated, for example, in spending money on Pakistan lives, but weren't actually what the council's responsibility.
So Councillor Howell, is there a question in there, please?
Well, no, it's not a question. It's just a point. I just think I am very worried.
Well, I've given you quite a lot of latitude.
Yeah,
this is for questions actually. So if we could concentrate on that, we've got a very big agenda to get through, and we are already at 7:20. So we need to speed up a little bit, I think. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, no, I just want to perhaps bring us back a little, because I feel we've moved away from the recommendations in the report. I think Mr. Richards has done a good job of convincing me that we're not committing ourselves to anything more than giving ourselves that extra headroom. In my mind, no matter what your current amount of debt threshold is, or what you've committed to over the next few years, if you've reached it for a period of 5 years, it is prudent in my mind to give yourself that extra headroom. We're not committed to using it each scheme that we would use, if we do decide to use that latitude, will be subject to the full scrutiny of the council and of overview and scrutiny. And so I think this is just a prudential thing, and it's being overthought in my mind. So I would just suggest that we move on. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Johnson. I'll go to Councillor Bartlett, who I think is online. Councillor Bartlett, are you there?
Yeah, good evening, Chairman. I've got a couple of questions, if I may, to Adam Richards, if possible. Firstly, my question is borrowing for to fund transformation. I don't know what a capitalisation direction is. Maybe I'm sorry, it's a bit of a dumb question, but maybe Mr. Richards could explain it. But my understanding is that it allows borrowing to be used for essentially revenue costs, provided that's used for then regeneration or other major benefits that the council can get from it. And if that is the case, my specific question is there sufficient room within the Treasury limits to enable the level of borrowing that would be required to fund the transformation programme? And then if that is the case, is there then sufficient confidence in the transformation programme that would support the level of borrowing that is sort of indicated to fund the transformation programme?
Mr. Richards. Thank you, Chair. And I think the member probably got a lot of that absolutely spot on, in the sense that as a council, you are not normally able to borrow to finance revenue expenditure. The transformation programme is principally revenue expenditure. So what the government would be allowing you to do is to undertake borrowing, spread that over a period of time, normally about 20 years, with regards to the repayment of that borrowing and the associated interest. The cost of that borrowing would be something that the council would need to factor within its medium-term financial plan and revenue budgets. But as we've stated earlier, that because we would be utilising it to fund our transformation programme, and that transformation programme and the level of savings associated have a relatively short payback, about 18 months, then hopefully you can start to see a robust business case being developed to support that process. That borrowing would be part of the overall thresholds, and as we've discussed tonight, the purpose of this paper is to give yourself extra headroom. Then it would be taken in account of the extra headroom that you are giving yourselves as part of that process. With regards to the transformation savings, I think I'm probably going to defer to my chief exec on behalf of the corporate management board to provide you with a response with regards to the level of assurance that we have around those level of savings.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think members know the transformation programme. We've gone through it in some detail over the last couple of years. We have as strong a level of assurance as we can on the savings that are in there. We have a very strong strategic implementation partner in the partnership between KPMG and Agilicis that are helping us to deliver those. So at this point in time, we are sure we can give assurance to the committee that we believe those savings will be delivered in the timescales. They're clearly going to be challenging. We have procurement savings. Actually, procurement savings are quite interesting to measure at the moment, given the rate of inflation in just about anything that we procure and buy. But we are sure at the moment that those are the right savings and they're baked into the budget. The budget is in fact dependent on us delivering those, so there's absolutely every reason to deliver them and very strong momentum behind them.
Could I just come back, Chair, on a point?
Briefly, Councillor Bartlett, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just for absolute clarity then, the current headroom within the Treasury limits does not currently allow for further borrowing to fund the transformation programme. In other words, this limit has got to be increased if we are going to be permitted to borrow money for the transformation programme. I just want to make sure that's absolutely understood.
Yeah, just to answer the question in the sense that no, not necessarily. It doesn't have to be increased, because you could make decisions as a council to reallocate the borrowing that you've already allocated to the schemes listed in the appendix. So you could make alternative decisions if you so desired.
Okay, so assuming all the existing programmes will go ahead, then there would not be sufficient headroom for transformation funding, assuming there were no changes in the current commitment.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies. I just wanted to clarify that the transformation programme is largely revenue spend. So without the capitalisation direction, we wouldn't be able to borrow capital to fund it. So I understand the question, but there is an element that actually we can't directly fund the transformation programme from new borrowing without the capitalisation direction.
Understood, thank you. And could I just make one last comment about the big plan? The big plan does set out the strategic direction of the council, and it's absurd to think that we're following a strategic plan that's not been approved by full council. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cox, you wanted to come back briefly?
Briefly, it was just on what the Chief Executive has just said about the KPMG not him being confident about the savings because of the assurances being given by KPMG, and this is the same organisation that's billed £10 million and can't split that up between which bits of works they've done, despite the fact that they've been asked to. So you know, who knows what that £10 million is made up of? Maybe half of it is made up of the big shot advice. Who knows? But we can. It seems ridiculous that we're giving so much store by a firm which can't even analyse its bill and has just been fined £14 million by the audit board.
Executive.
Sorry, Chairman, I was taking that to be a comment rather than a question. But that's helpful.
I just thought I'd give you the opportunity. So, members, there were no questions for Mr. Filmer. Please don't look disappointed, Mr. Filmer. I think your report stands on its merits in any case. We have spent a lot of time this evening on these other issues. It seems to me, as we get to the recommendations, that the fourth recommendation is one where no doubt these arguments will be rehearsed again and probably even for longer at full council on the 13th of September. So a suggestion that I was going to make through the Chief Executive, but back to perhaps the Leader of the Council, is that a members' seminar on these specific issues much closer to the time, so that they are fresh in everybody's minds in preparation for the 13th of September, may be time well spent in terms of whatever that debate turns out to be. So I just wanted to make that suggestion because it does seem to me there is a great deal of misunderstanding, if I can put it that way, around these potentially very political issues. And I think it would be helpful to all members, particularly those who haven't been closely involved, if they had the opportunity of hearing how this process is built up, what the checks and balances are, what the process will be out of the borrowing situation. And I think that's something which perhaps could be taken on board. Let's do it a matter of days before full council rather than weeks, and hopefully that will inform the debate at full council on the 13th of September. So that's very good of you, Councillor Brooke, and I'm extremely grateful to you for saying that. Thank you. So I'll go now to the recommendations. Recommendations 1, 2 and 3 are for noting. So they are to note the reported activity of Treasury Management Function 21-22, note the reported activity of the Treasury Management Function for April to June 2022, and to note and endorse the update on borrowing set out from paragraph 25 to 35. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is to deal with those three for noting as being noted by Audit and Governance Committee, and then I'll go to the next one after that.
It's noting and endorsing is the third one, which I would have a problem with endorsing.
In that case, I will do the first two rather than the first three. Could we note the first two for noting? Right. That's agreed. Without further debate, because there's been plenty of time for that, can we go to The third recommendation which is to note and endorse the update on borrowing set out in paragraphs 25 to 35. And I'll go straight to a vote on that. All those in favour, please indicate. Those against? So that is carried by a majority of 5 votes to 4. And then the fourth recommendation, and I'm not really expecting agreement on this, it's fair to say, is to approve and recommend to Council the revised prudential indicators set out in Table 9. All those in favour, please indicate. And those against? And that is carried by 5 votes to 4, and no doubt will form a substantial amount of debate at Council on the 13th of September. So that concludes item 8 on the agenda. May I say thank you to Mr. Filmer and to the rest of your team for the work and engagement you've had in preparing and delivering this report for us this evening. Thank you very much.
Chad, wasn't there a fifth recommendation that
you are absolutely correct, Councillor Cox. The fifth recommendation to be defined, I think, in terms of the exact wording, but is to recommend that a members' seminar is held in preparation for full council on the 13th of September, and for the reasons I set out a few moments ago. That was moved by me and seconded by Councillor Brooke. Could I go to a vote on that? All those in favour, please indicate. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, members. So that takes us to item 9 on the agenda, which is risk management and the corporate risk register update. We have Fiona Manton, the risk manager, I hope on the line for us to present the report. I'm sure members have read the report, and if that can be done in presentation reasonably speedily. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. I reluctantly have to inform you that Fiona Manson's been taken ill, so I will take this item if that's okay.
I wondered why I couldn't see her on the screen. So in her place, Mr. Stannard, please could you present the report?
Thank you, Chair. So what I propose is I was just going to run through the structural changes to the report that you asked for at your last committee and invite comment on those. And then if I could, through you, Chair, ask the Chief Executive and Richards to comment on any specific risks that they would want to highlight to you. So the first element you asked as a committee last time around was to construct Appendix 1, which is a history of the risks that have come and gone onto the risk register. So the current elements of the risk register are in bold, and those that have been taken off are not in bold. That doesn't mean that those risks may come back on, because that's the dynamic nature of a risk register. So that's the first appendix. The second appendix is then each individual risk spread over 2 pages. And what we've tried to do there, based on your feedback from the last committee, was to present a template format for each risk, showing the risk information, the key mitigations and actions that have been taken to date, any new key actions that are intended if the risk strategy is to treat that risk rather than accept the risk, and then show you in diagrammatic form at the bottom of each risk the movement during the quarter and the strategy. So I would be grateful if members could tell me whether that format is what they were after, maybe outside of the meeting. And through you, Chair, now I'd just like to ask Chief Executive or Adam whether they would like to talk about any of the specific risks.
Thank you very much indeed for filling in there at the last minute, Mr. Stannard. So I will go to Chief Financial Officer and Chief Executive, and then I'll come back to members for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if I can go first, just to highlight some of the changes. And I think it's fair to say that we live in a fairly dynamic risk environment at the moment. There are many changes, many pressures. The three I particularly wanted to mention were the risk around children's services, where I think as members are aware, we are seeing a strong move to get the council from inadequate into a better position for our children's services. We have a very strong improvement board, and the new DFE advisor is assisting us and working with Hampshire as our partner to take that forward. So my belief is that we're making progress, and hopefully we will see that come through. We've recently had an Ofsted visit, a focused visit, and I think there's been some good coverage of that in the press in terms of the comments on the changes we're making. The second one I want to mention is cyber security, just because as of today, this evening, I've seen another email that's come in, a phishing email to a member of staff purporting to be from me, saying, oh, can you just send me your WhatsApp number so I can talk about some urgent things I need you to do? And that sort of phishing email is coming in more and more regularly. Fortunately, we have staff that are risk aware, but I just want to flag the cybersecurity threat is an ever-present one, and one that is growing in nature. The third risk, obviously, just to talk about is CR9, which is the finance risk and the balancing of the budget at a time of very high inflation. We have seen some real pressures in our procurement and in all of our services. That is also having an impact on wages. And we've seen the employers make an offer, a flat offer of £1,925, I think it is, per year for all staff, regardless of grade. That apparently has been turned down today by Unison. By Unite. That offer alone would exceed our budget provision, even after the Cabinet have increased the budget provision earlier in the year to allow for inflation on salaries. So we do need to be very wary of the impact of some of these on our budget, both for this year and, of course, for future years. And, of course, the conversation around the Beach House SPV capitalisation direction as an option that is integral to the budget. So those are things to flag. My sense is that actually CR9 as written probably doesn't reflect the risk as we see it today. Maybe it did at the time we were drafting the report. That was a whole 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think the situation has changed. So I think if we were doing it now, we'd probably write a different risk review. My assurance to the committee is that we do keep the risks under constant review. Fiona Manton has a very, very good process of phoning each of the corporate risk owners and going through each of the risks with them every month. So we will look to update that for the next time it comes to this committee. I don't know if Mr. Richards would like to add in terms of the detail.
Mr. Richards?
Yeah, if I can, and maybe just add a couple of points of detail. So I think earlier in the meeting, I think members and the leader made reference to the capitalisation direction. So I can hopefully highlight that the council leadership has open communication with ministers at Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities that an alternative to our innovative approach of a special purpose vehicle may be better for the council and better meet the government's objectives. Officers of the council have open communication with the civil servants on the back of that conversation and are exploring it actively, and we expect to get a degree of clarity within the next few days as to whether or not a capital receipt from the securitisation of beach huts could be used to fund our transformational programme under the flexible use of capital receipts, or alternatively whether we will be given a capitalisation direction. We should have that clarity pretty soon. The other aspect that I think I would like to refer to is, as the Chief Executive said, is the constant need to be vigilant around the impact of inflation. And I think the Chief Executive referred to the pay award that was made by the national employers earlier in the week. You will know in our budget we allowed a 3.1% pay award, a flat rate of £1,925 on each and every grade or spinal column point within the council's pay structure means that anybody that is earning below 62,000 will be getting a more generous pay award than actually was assumed within that budget. Our average calculations at this moment in time is that it might be around about 5.4%. And as the Chief Executive highlighted, some of that was included within the June MTFP update report, and the work we did around trying to balance out those extra cost of living pressures. Some of it was not, and clearly we're going to need to keep that under constant review. The other aspect of that we're going to have to give some consideration to is, I think, the pay award also made a commitment to an extra day's leave for all officers, which will clearly be an additional cost that would have to be factored in to the council's operating and financial arrangements. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions on CR9. I'm sure Mr. Stannard and others might be able to answer any questions on any of the risks within the risk register.
Well, thank you, all three of you. Just before we go to questions from members, I would, from the chair, just like to comment on two things. The first is on the issue of phishing emails, to congratulate whoever it is in IT who's doing the online training. It's a very useful idiot's guide, as I found, and I'm sure plenty of other people have found. It's very basic, but it really draws your attention to the primary issues in a very clear way. So I would encourage more of that and more frequency of doing that. And the second thing, I think, is to remind ourselves how we dealt with the risk register as we came into the peak of COVID. And we ran a separate risk register at that time around COVID related issues over and above our normal risk register. We then later on combined the two so that we embedded those principles for the longer term. And I think my point is that we are living in even more uncertain times in different respects right now. And I think that it would be helpful, and it wouldn't be seen, I think, as a sign of weakness, probably as a sign of reality, if we were to look at how we could adapt our risk register procedure to incorporate some of these hopefully unique situations that we're now facing. Perhaps that's something to take away and to think about, and to make sure that we don't therefore edge towards doing this at too slow a pace, which could so easily happen in a busy world. And I think perhaps if, rather than getting into the minutiae of that this evening, could I perhaps suggest that the Chief Executive and other officers take that away to consider how we could best utilise that and make our risk process as fit for purpose as we possibly can into today's circumstances. Members, Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And can I just say that that's an excellent idea, and I think that should be taken forward. And I would fully endorse the fact that we are living in exceptional circumstances. When you get people on the radio stations crying because they don't realise they can pay their heating bills in the winter, then I think we are in a dire position. One point I wanted to, I was going to dwell on CR9, which has already been dwelt on, so I don't want to dwell on it anymore. But I do note that it has been accepted that risk is definitely increased significantly, partly because of developments to do with the budget, the cost of living crisis, but also the fact that our funding from various sources is uncertain as we speak. I was surprised that the Chief Executive didn't raise the matter of the people strategy, which is the one area that has increased. And certainly, if you read the commentary, is quite alarming, because actually, at the end of the day, the council is about its people, and if the people who are delivering the services that we provide are very unhappy, which it looks like they are, then we're going to fail on several fronts. And so I would have said that should be incorporated in any emergency measure at all. And the people strategy is connected, I suspect, to the pay awards as well. And if we're not getting the pay awards right, if we're not getting the equalisation of pay right, then we are in danger of falling apart in terms of delivery of service on many levels. One of the other things I just wanted to comment on was, I can't remember the CR number, but it was the one in terms of the transformational savings, because obviously Chief Financial Officer has already mentioned the failure of the securitisation of the beach shots, or the potential failure of the securitisation of the beach shots. We don't know. That's the funding mechanism for the transformation, and if that's at risk, then transformation's at risk, presumably. And therefore, I would have like to have seen certainly an increase in the risk from that level alone, if nothing else.
Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, my comment on the recent changes, actually, these papers are probably written 3 weeks ago and then submitted 2 weeks ago. So any changes that have taken place since then wouldn't be reflected in them. I think what I was trying to bring out in my commentary were those changes that have happened since the papers were drafted. And the people strategy one, I think, is a risk that is with us, that is affecting most employers at the moment in terms of difficulty of recruiting people and keeping people. I recognise the issue about staff satisfaction, and that's a long-term strategy through the staff survey and then the action plan from that. So happy to bring back further details at a later date, but I think that's something that would normally go through Cabinet in terms of the work that we're doing to retain staff. But happy to pick it up in more detail here if necessary.
And I think those issues tie in quite neatly with what I was saying prior to that. So I think those issues need to be borne in mind when you're formulating that further risk work. Councillor Howell?
Yes, I'm not familiar in detail with the subject matter I'm going to talk about because it's related to housing and I haven't sat on that committee. But I am worried about the increasing rents, especially at the lower level of at the lower level in BCP in terms of affordability, because increasing numbers of people are, well, even before the cost of living crisis, really struggling to find accommodation. The council has been struggling to help people find accommodation, and estate agents have been encouraging landlords to increase their rents because of the lack of supply. So I'm not certain whether, you know, the difficulties caused by that impose a great cost on the council financially, but certainly reputationally, I would think there would be a cost, and I just wonder if that is something that is under consideration in terms of a risk.
So you're talking about external private sector housing, because obviously council housing through the HRA is set at the time of the budget and doesn't incorporate those large increases. I wonder, Mr. Richins or Mr. Stannard, whether you could comment on Councillor Howell's question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just remind the committee and Councillor Howell that below the corporate risk register there are service risk registers, and obviously this issue that Councillor Howell's talking about would be on the housing risk register. What I can do is I can take it offline, Councillor Howell, and give you assurance and maybe a snapshot of the housing risk register so you can see how that risk is articulated.
Thank you.
I'll move seat. It's the only way. Okay, I hope that's better. Good. A number of the points I wanted to raise have already been mentioned, so I won't deal with those, but there are a number I would like to make and possibly include some questions as well within that. There's reference to the ONS process in several of these risks. What is particularly worrying for me is the fact that the setup that we originally operated with an ONS board and other committees and meeting at least 6 times a year rather, gave us the opportunity to look at a whole series of elements within the council's programme. And the emphasis, and we got recognised for this in terms of focusing on risk. And of course, this is what we're doing tonight. But it is clear that there has subsequently been a significant reduction in the scrutiny process, now only 5 times in the year, and there's no ONS board which dealt with some of the higher level elements of the council. And it seems to me that we are facing a deteriorating situation and therefore not able to focus totally on the risks that do exist. So I just draw your committee's attention to that particular point, and officers as well, that I think we've had a retrograde step in terms of scrutiny, more trying to avoid the appropriate scrutiny and risk discussions. So that concerns me because it doesn't come over in these risk assessments strongly at all, because it keeps on saying ONS is okay, etc. I don't think it is. There is reference to reputational damage to the seasonal challenge, and it does seem to me that the process that was used last year and therefore has been reflected and upgraded, I understand, for this year, but we still see exactly the same amounts of litter and issues over car parking, PCNs, towing and everything else, that it probably is necessary to carry out some sort of review of that process, because it doesn't seem to be working as we would want it to. That's CRL, I can't remember which particular risk that is, but it's in there. There's also to reputational damage, the planning issues and the customer interface. And we all know that the customer interface is not just a COVID hangover, and it does relate to the point that the chief executive made in terms of being able to retain staff and recruit staff. And there's a real risk over the next couple of years, especially with the pay and reward programme being deferred, that we are going to continue to have a significant capacity problem in dealing with the individual services and also the transformation. So I've got major concerns there, which I think need to be highlighted more strongly within the risk register. And the planning, it ought to be possible, and we ought to know how many of the applications have been dealt with within the original time of 8 weeks or whatever it is for the larger applications, and how many have been, and what proportion of the total have been counted as being done in time by agreed extensions, because we shouldn't be having any agreed extensions at all. And it does seem to me that just grouping the two together and saying that we are 93% successful is twisting the data a little bit, if we've had to have 70 or 80% of those actually have been as a result of extending the time and getting agreement there. So I think there's a big issue there that needs to be addressed. And I'll come back to planning when we come to the forward plan. So that's...
I'm not sure there was a question now. I think Councillor Brooke is
it was comments and expressing concerns that I don't feel the risk register is addressing the issues as strongly as it perhaps ought to, and that there are weaknesses as a result of the reductions in scrutiny.
So without getting into a long debate on the subject, we did look at 2 of those issues with regard to planning and with regard to customer in audit and governance. And I think what I would ask is that perhaps Mr. Stannard, you could get Ms. Manton to relook at the composition of those items within the risk register to see whether they fully reflect what we agreed at that time. Notwithstanding that obviously some things will have moved on in the interim, because they were issues that were big enough and important enough, we felt as a committee, to be looking at, to be having a debate about, and to see whether we could measure those improvements that were necessary. I hope, Councillor Brooke, that partially answers from the remit that we've already given to ourselves on those two topics. So, members, Councillor Cox, I'm just conscious of time and the importance of other papers that we have to consider this evening.
Chair's just about to collapse. I just wanted to raise the CR in relation to climate change, because I didn't feel as though that addressed the risks at all. And there, you know, it talks about acute and chronic, and yet there doesn't seem to be any actions in there which address the fact that the situation is acute and chronic. And we've only seen in the last month how acute and chronic it is. And I was particularly disappointed with the list of what appears to be achievements in the last quarter, which really amount to pretty pathetic response to a climate emergency, which we have declared. And it just talks about launching this from paper drafted, application made, further electric vehicles, nature recovery scheme pilots, consultant appointed. Now that's a really good achievement, isn't it, for a climate change, and a green infrastructure strategy on the forward plan. These are not achievements in terms of the climate, in addressing the climate change, and therefore, you know, I'm disappointed. That's all I just wanted to comment on.
Well, again, like the previous item, Mr. Stannard, can you perhaps convey those back to Ms. Manton in her absence? So, members, could we just move to the recommendation, which is that we note the update provided in this report relating to corporate risks, and perhaps we would like members to add two things. One is to note and relay the comments that members have made back to the risk manager, and secondly, I think the issues that I responded to the Chief Executive about at the start of this item with regard to how we look at these exceptional risks. I'll leave it to Mr. Hanson to put my original thoughts into script, or you can remember. Now, with those incorporated, members, could we agree that as our really expanded recommendation? In fact, I will go to a vote on it. All those in favour, please indicate. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, members. So it takes us on. I don't mean to rush us, but I know that external audit is going to take up a little bit of time, and the remainder of the papers are all for Mr. Stannard. And although the agenda looks long, they are, I hope, relatively straightforward for the committee. So could we go to item 10, which is internal audit, quarterly audit plan update. Mr. Stannard, Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So quarter one 22-23, as you can imagine, is a busy period for the internal audit team. Simplified, we've got 4 key deliverables in the quarter. Number 1 is getting the previous year's audit plan over the line quickly, but without compromising quality or coverage. Number 2 is kicking off the new year's audit plan. Number 3, facilitating the production of the draft annual governance statement in collaboration with management, and that's obviously reported later in the agenda. And then finalising all the other work associated with the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report and overall opinion, which is also in the agenda later. I only really want to point out one matter of detail in the report, and that's in paragraph 4, and it's the debtors audit on line 3 of the table, and then the text that follows in paragraph 5. You'll note there's an asterisk against it, and I just want members to be clear that that report is still not finalised with management, and consequently the recommendations and the issues that are highlighted in 5 may need updating. So what I propose is that I'll transparently provide that update in the next quarterly update report. That's that issue. Finally, if I just move to paragraph 6, this is a certainly the second table in paragraph 6 is a new feature. So first of all, we're highlighting the audits that are in progress. That's in table 1, and they're numbered 1 to 17. And then the new feature that we agreed through the audit charter work we did when you approved that is to give you a snapshot or a pre-look at the audits that we're planning for quarter 2. So you can get a feel for both the work in progress and the work that's planning in the background. So I hope you find that useful, and happy to take any questions.
Bernard, any questions? Councillor Phipp.
Yeah, that table on page 69, the first table, audits in progress. I don't know what you mean by, perhaps you could just tell me, number 17, various grant award scoping. What is actually how I'm presuming these are the grant awards that we made under ARG and Bounce Back. And what does scoping mean? Because obviously I've got some issues with that, as you know, and we've been in correspondence. And I'd just like to know, first of all, what scoping means, and I may come back if I could, please.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank Councillor Phipps. The counter fraud element in brackets is annually the NFI do a newsletter to councils to say, be careful, these are the frauds that are prevalent across the country at the moment. And so this particular audit has an emphasis on disabled facilities grants, because they are a big spend for councils, and they are an increasing, reluctantly, an increasing area for fraud. That will be the major emphasis on that audit. However, the scoping is essentially discussing with management what grants we're going to specifically look at, and therefore, based, combination of the information from the NFI newsletter and through discussions with management will determine what grants we look at there.
Oops.
So you don't even know what grants you're looking at yet, whether you're going to even be looking at ARG Bounce Back. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, well, in that case, I'd like you to propose that you do look at ARG Bounce Back, because I've got a lot of issues with it. As you know, we had a presentation here, and I believe that certainly we were misled on 2 issues from that presentation, as I have found out since. I didn't know at the time. I can tell you what they are if you want now, but I've obviously been in correspondence with you. I've been in correspondence, as you know, with you. It seems to me that every time I raise issues, I've actually been in correspondence as well with the Chief Executive on certain issues, and I haven't had a response on some of it either. There are issues, and every time it all gets taken back to the Economic Development Department to basically mark their own homework. We're not going anywhere. There isn't any scrutiny on this at all that I can see. The government aren't going to do scrutiny. We've also been in touch with BEIS, and they're basically saying, well, it's all down to the council. We're not doing this, we're not doing that. They might do something. They might take something random. But I have a lot of issues, not only with the one grant that I have been talking about, but there are other things where I believe this council has actually benefited from the grant, which they shouldn't have done from a grant. There's press release to prove it. There's a lot that that's basically gone on here. There's money given to companies that have got hundreds of thousands on their balance sheets, others that weren't even struggling. I think there's issues, and I would like it added onto here, in my opinion, that bounce back and ARG is looked at in more detail.
Mr. Stannard?
I can only note Councillor Phipps's comments, and I'll consider that in that, you know, obviously we've had correspondence via email, haven't we? I have to consider the risks here, and, you know, we need to understand what the BEIS audit is going to entail, so we don't commit scarce council resources to an audit. I appreciate you have a view that that audit may not be robust, but it's the, you know, I think that's got to take its course first, and then I can determine after that whether there's risks that the council need to look at.
Could I suggest, therefore, that we give Mr. Stannard the opportunity to consider that? We don't sort of try and make this up on the hoof this evening, and I appreciate Councillor Phipps the passion you hold for getting to the heart of these issues. But in so doing, perhaps I could ask Mr. Stannard to respond by email so that we all know what that position is at that time. And I think that would probably be best done by an email to all members of this committee, rather than just singling out me as the chairman and Councillor Phipps as the sole member. I'm reluctant to put a time frame on that because of the issues around bays and so forth externally, which we're not in control of. But I would imagine that isn't going to happen during the course of the summer recess. I would have thought it more likely to happen sometime towards the autumn, but actually having had so much time go by, it would be better for it to be accurate rather than premature. So if we could ask for that, Mr. Stannard, I think that would be helpful.
Could I just possibly, it might help if I literally bullet pointed the issues that I have got, the main issues where I think things are not right with this at all, generally, and the information that this committee has been given that was wrong, and a lot of other issues. And if I perhaps could send those to you, that would help with your consideration. Could I do that? Would that be all right? I'm happy to include.
Yes, I think that would be fine. I think I would like to be copied in on that. The fact that you send them in doesn't mean that they are absolute and they're proven. I think we need to look at them, and there will be aspects of it which involve economic development. I took your point on board just now, but we can't leave everything at the door of Mr. Stannard on this. He's the internal audit function, and I recognise the difference between those two necessities between him and the administration by economic development. So please do that, and make sure that you copy me, and we'll give sufficient time. It won't be an instant process. Give sufficient time for Mr. Stannard and colleagues to deal with it. Councillor Howell.
Yes, we've in previous items we've heard a lot about business cases, and you know, because of the likely increase in investments, in inverted commas, then we're going to have more of those business cases coming through. What I would like to understand is and has there been any audit? Do any of the ongoing processes analyse whether a proper business case process is being whether there's a process in place and whether it is being followed? You know, I'm particularly concerned that we've had several instances where proposed investments have come to council and with draft valuations provided by valuers, and those no evidence actually that those have actually been firmed up into final valuations. You know, I think that there's clearly an issue in terms of whether the council can rely on a valuation if it doesn't proceed to getting the final valuation from the valuer. There's also the related concern that the administration may be deliberately keeping documents as draft so that they do not have to disclose them to other councillors. And certainly I believe that this was probably the case in relation to the beach huts proposal and the KPMG report there, which we asked for, and the leader refused to provide to us on the basis that he had that right as it was drafted under the Constitution. So it's really important, I think, that our controls, our audit controls, do not allow these processes to slip and either be not be followed or be manipulated. Thank you.
Well, you'll see from the report the scope and range of the audits that are in progress and are planned. So I'm not sure that they will fulfil you with the answer you're looking for, but I'll leave Mr. Stannard to respond.
I think we have to be careful about the scope of internal audit here. We've got a constitution and we've got a governance process, and whether business cases are, Adam's talked about it earlier, about they stand and fall as they're presented on each individual basis.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I think you misunderstand me. I'm not talking about assessing the commercial validity of a business case. I'm talking about having a proper process to put that together. For example, if you seek a valuation, then you proceed to actually getting a full valuation that you can rely on because the valuer signed off on it, and not a draft one, which in some cases we appear to be, that's as far as we go in the process. Thank you.
Donald.
Noted, Councillor Beasley and Cow.
Mr. Richards.
Chair, I think the point has been made. I think it would be worthy of officer consideration, because my understanding is that if any business case comes forward with a draft valuation, normally those business cases are then subject to further due diligence and sign-off processes. And as part of that sign-off processes, there is acceptable parameters. And if there was any significant change to the valuation, I would expect that to go through the appropriate governance arrangements.
Could I ask to see that process document so that I can understand, what officers are obliged to do when they?
Mr. Richards, Chief Executive.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether the answer might be for Councillor Howe to spend some time with Corporate Property Officer or the team to go through the process, and then happy to produce any documents that come from that.
I'd rather see the documents first and then follow up if I need to. Thank you.
Do that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cox.
Don't say with such a sigh, will you, Mr. Chair?
Well, no, I'm just conscious.
It's just a quickie.
The other important work of this committee, which members will want to spend time on, will get rushed because we're spending far more time than we ever normally do on the routine internal audit paper, and we're straying out of the broad parameters of what we normally do. And now that's
if
fine.
you just want us to rubber stamp these reports, then we'll walk off. There's no point being here if we can't question them.
I knew that would be your response, but you know as well as I do the length of the agenda that has to be got through this evening, and I'm just very keen that we don't then end up rushing other important business. And you wouldn't have it any other way, I am sure.
I'll be here till the end.
I'm sure that's right. So your further point on internal audit.
I was just going to ask Nigel if you could elaborate slightly on the debtors to ask us how much is at risk in terms of bad debts that we might incur.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Just to be clear, the Radius system is one of two systems the council currently runs, and it's the lesser of the two systems. So there's much more debt going through the other system, which is a capita system. The exact debt, I don't want to provide a figure that's a net. I'll be working from memory, and I don't want to give you that. So can I give you that information outside the meeting, please? Thank you.
So, members, can we just go to the recommendation on this report, which is that Audit and Governance Committee note the progress made and the issues arising on the delivery of the 2022-23 internal audit plan. Can we so note? Thank you very much indeed. That now takes us on to item 11, which is external audit and the progress update. As I referred to earlier in the meeting, we did distribute an update which I asked to be concise, which it was. It ran to 2 pages to give said update, and that was following the meeting that I told Audit and Governance that I would ensure that I held with officers partway through the interim between Audit and Governance meetings, and we held that on the 12th of July, out of which came the paper drafted by Mr. Barber from Grant Thornton, and which, as amended, was then the one that got sent out. So online we have Peter Barber from Grant Thornton, and I believe also with you are Mark Bartlett and or Sam Harding. And so I'd ask you, Mr. Barber, to present to the committee, and I'll then go to Mr. Richins, Chief Financial Officer, for input from the council side of this process. Over to you, Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. Good committee. Just for clarity, Chair, unfortunately, Sam and Mark Bartlett are unable to attend today, so it's just me from Grant Thornton. So in terms of the item you have in front of you, this is our progress report that sets out the position in respect to both the 2021 and 21-22 audits. And just to remind members of the committee that as your external auditors, our responsibilities are twofold. It's an opinion on your financial statements and it's a VFM conclusion. And if I look back to my last attendance at this committee back in April, I did provide you with an update on the opinion for the 2021 audit. And at that juncture indicated that there were 2 issues causing a delay to the sign off of the 2021 audit. And those were infrastructure assets and the pension fund letter of assurance from the Dorset Pension Fund auditor. As summarised in the document that was circulated that the chair referred to and in my progress report today, very little progress has been made since that April meeting. And the main reason for that is that we, as your external auditors, as is the case for the council, are reliant on third parties to gain assurance and evidence that we need to be able to conclude in these 2 areas. If I take each of those areas in turn, I'll start with the infrastructure. So just to remind members that this is a national issue, it's affecting a large number of councils that haven't had their 2021 audit signed off. And I suspect, well, not suspect, I know it will impact on an even larger number as the 21-22 audits get underway. And in response to this infrastructure issue, SIPFA got involved early in the process and they provided a consultation draft setting out some additional guidance and options for resolving this issue. And that was circulated to key stakeholders, including councils and including us and other firms responsible for public sector audit. And as Grant Thornton, we responded to that as part of the consultation process. At that point in time, SIPFA were indicating that they would then finalise the guidance for issuing in late June. That, however, has not happened, and at the point of drafting the report you have in front of you, that was still outstanding. The continued delay in the SIPFA guidance has arisen. Well, my understanding of the reason why it's arisen is based on the fact that SIPFA sought guidance from FRAB, who are the Financial Reporting Advisory Board. So they are public sector specific, and they approve things like changes to the code and consideration of impacts of decisions on accounting standards. So before finalising their guidance, SIPFA sought buy-in from FRAB, and it appears that FRAB had a different view, and on that basis SIPFA decided not to issue the guidance but reconsider their position. And this was formally confirmed yesterday in a letter from SIPFA that was issued to Section 151 officers throughout the country, where they indicated that the guidance would not be issued yet, and indicating that they were now seeking an alternative solution to the challenges faced by councils, including BCP, via what they call a statutory override. And that statutory override is for those of you that are cited on it, along the same lines as the statutory override that exists at present and has done for a number of years in relation to the dedicated schools grant deficits that a number of councils, including BCP, have, and the fact that that override for the dedicated schools grants avoids the need for the council to offset any debts or the deficits on that balance against their general fund. So this statutory override that SIPFA are seeking would essentially mean that for public sector auditors, infrastructure assets would be outside the scope of the audit. So that is their latest proposal, but they have indicated in the letter that there will be a time involved in seeking that because, amongst other things, it will need government approval. Informally, within Grant Thornton, we think that is probably a couple of months away. So given that the letter was only issued yesterday, we are considering it. But realistically, in relation to infrastructure, that leaves two options. One is that the statutory override is obtained, and we are planning to wait to September or whenever that is to see if that is the case, in which case there will be a relatively straightforward solution. If there is further delays, or if that statutory override is not forthcoming, then the only alternative way forward is a qualification on the grounds of our inability to gain assurance over the material accuracy of infrastructure. Now, if that latter option is adopted, that does create some issues because that will be a qualification. It won't be for just 1 year, it continues, and it will affect a large number of audits within the public sector, and therefore you could argue undermines the transparency and the accountability of public sector transactions. So the statutory override is clearly the preferred option, but we recognise that that is in the early stages of being put forward by SIPFA. So what we are doing now, and we will be doing over the next few weeks for all our audits affected, is collating further information on the position and the numbers involved and the types of assets that we're dealing with. We've had communications with officers at the council, and we've got another meeting booked in with finance officers on Monday to talk about this in more detail before we submit our return to the team in the centre. So that's a quite up-to-date update on the infrastructure, recognising it's moving fast. And that then takes me on to the second area, the pension fund liability disclosure, where I think for a number of meetings now I've been indicating that we've been chasing the Dorset Pension Fund auditor, and there is no change there. We've had further communications from them, probably about a week and a half ago, indicating that the individual from Deloitte undertaking the work is away on leave, and that the partner will be picking that up on the individual's return and seeking to get the work done at the earliest opportunity prior to issuing us with the letter. But that's what we've been told for some time now. So once again with this issue, and I think I discussed this at the previous meeting, we have discussed with officers alternative procedures. But invariably those alternative procedures mean going in to Dorset Pension Fund and actually testing the detailed transactions, and that's got all sorts of complications in terms of accessibility and resource commitments, and something that we're desperate to avoid. So on both of those areas we have further work to do. And I suppose just for a bit of context, I've not got any more up-to-date figures, but I know when I reported through to you previously, as at the 31st of March, so yes, some 4 months ago, just over 50% of audits had had their opinion issued for 2021, 52%. And as I've set out in my progress report, I think it would be safe to assume that very few of the larger organisations with material infrastructure, such as BCP, will have had anything signed off since then. So it is important, although frustrating for members of this committee, to recognise that the delay is due to issues outside our control as auditors and your officers in terms of their role in producing draft accounts for audit. Chair, I could go on to talk about VFM and 21-22, but would it be, given the amount of detail I've just gone through, to pause there and see if there are any questions on 2021 opinion?
Well, I think before you do, Mr. Barber, I'll go, as I said earlier, I'll go to Mr. Richins to augment what you've said from the position of BCP as the local authority client. Mr. Richins.
Thank you, Chair. And as the external auditor has highlighted, I can confirm that as a Section 151 officer, I received the correspondence from SIPFA just before lunchtime today. That document does refer to the issues with regards to infrastructure asset reporting. It talks about the consideration of a statutory override based on the various responses they had to their original consultation. My concern is, we're talking potentially the autumn before we get a resolution. This means that the team will be dealing with the 2020-21 accounts and the 21-22 accounts, both at the same time, both open, expected to answer questions at a time of incredible pressure that the team are under for various reasons, including the establishment and implementation of a new ERP system. Clearly this isn't a local matter to BCP Council. The issue will also snowball because those authorities that weren't caught by this issue last year with regards to 2020-21 accounts, because they had them signed off before the matter was raised, will also now get caught within that net. So I think this has a real credibility issue with regards to the assessment of the audit process for local government, and one that I think we all need to be concerned about.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Richins. So I'll now go to members before going back, as offered by Mr. Barber a moment ago. Councillor Phipps.
Thank you. Obviously, we've discussed this at many meetings. I think, can't remember where the first one was when all this came up. But at the end of the day, it's becoming, sorry, I don't know if this is the right word, laughable. It would be laughable. It wasn't so serious, really. You seem to be putting a lot of stead on the issue about the infrastructure, but that only came into play because we didn't get the letter of assurance about the pension fund, which I believe we should have had before the infrastructure issue became an issue. And we keep saying, oh, there's all these councils, half of the councils still haven't got theirs or haven't got theirs signed off. Actually, half of them have, and they actually got their everything that they needed, and we didn't. And I just absolutely failed to understand how we can't get hold of anybody after all this time to deal with this pension fund. I mean, has anybody actually been there, knocked on the door? Just because we heard somebody was ill, I think at one of the meetings, they've been off sick. Now they've gone on holiday or something. For goodness sake, it's unbelievable to me, totally unbelievable, that this sort of situation could arise where we can't get hold of anybody to get a letter of assurance. And have you anybody actually been there to where this office is and knocked on the door? And do they not have superiors that you can deal with? Can you just give us a bit more information on that, please?
Mr. Barber.
Yeah, through you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, we've used all avenues available, but actually, if you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We've not got anywhere, despite countless communications at a national level or local level. I know that there's been significant effort made by the chair, speaking with colleagues, given his connection with the pension fund. I know that the Section 151 officer has been speaking with colleagues at Dorset. There has been lots of attempts, but this is in my experience of 30 years of audit unheard of such delays. But ultimately, without it, I cannot proceed. So it is infuriating. Lots of adjectives could be used to describe where we are. You may think laughable is one, but actually, it is far from a laughing matter as far as I'm concerned, because I'm immensely frustrated. And actually, I think that I've done all I can to pursue this, but ultimately, if we can't get it, we just have to wait. And it's a reflection, due to the circumstances that we're in, that we cannot proceed at this point in time. So, I'm not going to suggest or concede that we haven't done what we should be doing, because I think we have, and I think we continue to push. But ultimately, until it materialises, I cannot proceed.
The only offer I can make to you, Councillor Phipps, comes out of what Mr. Barber said. My connections with the pension fund, the two Section 151 officers, from BCP through Mr. Richins, and through Aidan Dunn, who is the 151 for Dorset Council. The sticking point is getting that contact with the person in Deloitte, who are their external auditors, same as Grant Thornton are our external auditors. I'm happy to try again, perhaps with a Teams call that involves Aidan Dunn, involves Adam Richards, involves myself, involves Peter Barber, just to see whether there is any chink in there that we can break through. More than happy to do that. If officers would like to arrange it, then we will do that. But if we fail, there are no other avenues available to twist the arm up the back of Deloitte more than we would with our own external auditors in similar circumstances. And if you'd like us to pursue that offer, then I'm more than prepared to do so. Would that help? Or might it help? Fine. Councillor Howell.
Yes, as I'm new to this committee, I just wonder if it's possible. I don't want to take up any significant time, but is there possible to again explain the infrastructure issue in 30 seconds? What's changed? It's obviously something's changed in the last year or so, which means that you can't get information that you used to get, or
Yeah. Chair, once again, yeah, thank you. So this all, you're absolutely right, Councillor. It stems from an issue that arose at another firm responsible for public sector audit when they were reviewed by the Financial Reporting Council. So by way of background, all audit firms are subject to quality reviews on the quality of their audit. One of the other firms was subject to a review and was criticised heavily for the work that they did, gaining assurance over the carrying value of infrastructure within the audit subject to review. All firms speak together periodically with SITFA and with the NAO, and this issue came up, and in consultation with this firm, all the other firms agreed that this was something that they probably needed to revisit in terms of whether they were getting adequate coverage over infrastructure. And all of them concluded that if the FRC, who hold us to account, are critical and they think we should be doing more, we want to do more because we don't want to be criticised. So The issue is that infrastructure, so your roads, your bridges, your street furnitures, whatever it may well be, they are significant at upper tier councils, including yourself. So we're looking at hundreds of millions of pounds. How are they valued in your accounts? They are valued at depreciated historic cost. So what that means is if you spent £20 million in a year on roads, bridges, street lighting, what you would do is you would add that to your balances and you would depreciate it straight line over an estimated useful life that may be 30, 40 years. So you depreciate it and you continue to do that every year. What the FRC questioned the other firm of auditors on was, well, if that is the case, how are you gaining assurance that the council is removing and de-recognising assets, infrastructure assets that might have a carrying value when new work is done on an existing piece of infrastructure? So if you decide to change your street lights from old style lighting to LED, how do you know that by spending £2 million doing that you aren't double counting some of the old lighting that you've now replaced? How can the council demonstrate that that has been fully depreciated and it may have had £5 million spent on it, but it's been fully depreciated since it was installed? Or is there a risk that they're being double counted and therefore infrastructure being overstated? It applies exactly the same for a road when it's resurfaced. How can the council demonstrate, and does it have sufficient records to say that this was last resurfaced, 39 and a half years ago, and therefore we are satisfied that over the intervening period it's been fully written out and therefore it's appropriate to add on the new spend and you still have the correct carrying value. And to varying degrees, all councils do not have sufficiently detailed records that break assets down into individual assets. Sorry, that don't have registers that break it down into individual assets to be able to demonstrate that they are not overstating infrastructure. Sorry, that's a lot more than 30 seconds, but it's a complex area.
Very useful, thank you.
Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are two issues obviously here, and I have to say I completely disagree with you on the pension fund. I think there are other routes. And I've already mentioned the qualification route. You qualify, you can't get the information, so you put a qualification in. And the second route is you sue them. They are actually providing a service, and they are failing to provide a service. And because they're failing to provide a service particularly in a timely manner, then actually that's costing us money, and it's costing us quite a bit of money. I expect increasing amounts of money. And therefore, you should send them a legal letter threatening to sue them, because that's what I would do if they're not providing a service and they are delaying everything and costing us lots of money. They should be sued, no doubt about it. So that's the first, the pension schemes. In terms of the infrastructure problems, I'm sorry, Mr. Barber, I believe that you and the profession, or you and SITFA, are bringing the profession into disrepute. Because this is appalling. This situation should never ever have arisen, and it should not be taking this long to sort it out. I'm sure you'll agree with me that one of the fundamental aspects of accounting is providing information in a timely manner. You're not providing information in a timely manner. It's not, by the time these accounts ever get signed off, there'll be a complete waste of time, because you'll have the next year. You should have the next year. So we're all wasting our time, to be honest, dealing with last year's when we should be doing, or the year before last year's, we should be doing last year's. And I think, again, that you should draw a line under it. You should draw a line under it, and just if you have to qualify, you have to qualify. And I was quite struck by one of the paragraphs in your report, which says that you're not signing anything off, qualified or otherwise. Now that's what you've said on page 80. And I think that's you're holding the council to hostage on this particular issue, and I think that's wrong. And you should not be doing that, and you should be coming up with constructive ways in which offering the council a way out of this. And the way out of this is to say we'll provide the accounts and we'll qualify on stuff that we can't get information on. That's fair, and this this solution that you talk about, the statutory override, you know, that is again bringing the accounts into dispute, because so that's two huge areas of the accounts which we're not having anything to do. Or we'll look at the accounts, but we're not looking at those two big items because they're too complicated. I mean, it's the whole accounts will be a waste of time if you start doing that with everything that's a bit too complicated. So I'm sorry, I disagree with this statutory override. We've got one statutory override already. We certainly don't need another one. And you know, we need to get a solution, and in the meantime, just qualify and move on.
So, Mr. Barber, Councillor Cox has been robust in his criticism of what I've said and of what you've said. Could you respond to both those issues, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I completely dispute that. I think a qualification is as an auditor and as a council, you should be working wherever possible and pursuing every avenue to avoid a qualification. It's not a badge of honour. It's not. The audit process should not be about getting the work done, no matter what, in a timely manner. The most important thing is having a set of accounts that have been properly reviewed and challenged, that give you and the public the assurances over the completeness and accuracy of those figures. And it would be more than my professional career's worth to sign off until I'm ready to do so. And I completely dispute the fact that I should be forcing the issue. I would prefer to wait and make sure I do it in the correct manner, in accordance with what all my colleagues and all the other firms are doing, which is not pursuing this qualification route. And that is an absolute consistent view that's been expressed not by Grant Thornton but all the other firms as well. Qualifications should be avoided wherever possible, and I believe it's appropriate to work with the council and officers to seek to come to that solution where we get to a position where your accounts are not qualified unless they absolutely need to be.
And the former issue was that regarding Deloitte and Councillor Cox's view,
yeah,
that we should be suing Deloitte rather than trying to find a way forward, as I've suggested.
So in the spirit of cooperation between different firms within the public sector audit appointments have a memo of engagement where there is an expectation and where individual firms are encouraged to work with others to facilitate the timely and efficient delivery of audits. And that includes within the detailed guidance the requirement for auditors of local government pension schemes to provide and respond to auditors of admitted bodies work and assurances over the arrangements operating within that pension fund. So that's the framework that's existed for many, many years within the public sector, and it's worked incredibly well and incredibly successfully. In my case, I've never had any problems up until now, and this is the first time that there has been such a significant and prolonged delay. And we've mentioned this to public sector audit appointments. They're cited on it. They know that there are a number of our audits for 2021 that have not been signed off because of this one issue. So yes, there are two issues for you, but actually there's a number of other councils and a number of other audited bodies quite close to you that their auditors are not signing off because they're purely waiting on a letter of assurance from the Dorset Pension Fund auditor. So public sector audit appointments who appoint me and Grant Thornton as your appointed auditor, that's who I've got the contract with, who have appointed Deloitte to Dorset Pension Fund and Dorset Council are cited on this. But PSAA recognised that completing this work and the resource challenges that exist within the individual firms, and that is generally reflected in the significantly reduced number of audits that have been signed off in accordance with the timelines in recent years. But we will not be going down the route of suing Deloitte.
I never thought for a minute that Grant Thornton could be suing Deloitte. It's actually, it should be the people who actually who are employing Deloitte that should be suing them. And as far as I'm concerned, that should be the council's responsibility, along with Dorset Council. But they should be putting pressure. You know, I'm the last person I want to start auditors being sued, because that just increased my premiums for no other reason. But you can certainly put pressure on them and send them a legal letter to threaten it, because the excuse that you've just used is resource allocation issues in the profession. Well, we've all got those. I've got those, for that to be the reason for us not having an assurance letter signed and an audit opinion signed is unacceptable, because that's what we pay auditors to do in a timely manner. And I disagree with Mr. Barber on obviously on the infrastructure elements. You know, at the end of the day, you know, if you can't get to a solution, and God only knows you've had long enough to sort this issue out with infrastructure, then you should draw a line under it and move on. And hopefully the current year it will have been sorted out, and you will be able to issue an unqualified opinion. But as for last year, let's just move on.
Well, thank you for that, Councillor Cox. We've heard your view. We've heard Mr. Barber's response. I'm quite happy to raise the issue of whether Dorset Council wish to sue their own external auditors at the next meeting that we hold, but it won't be for us to do so because they're not engaged by us. Although I appreciate that you seem to think that we failed by holding previous meetings, that's no good reason to stop holding future meetings, and that's what I proposed earlier on this item. It's what I hope and intend that we will do, because I think it's the right thing to do, and it's our responsibility to keep trying to do that. And you won't see me cease from that obligation just because you think it's a waste of time. Councillor Butt.
No, sorry, Chair. No, I'm not going to ask a question now. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for Mr. Barber from members of the committee? No. In that case, can we go to the recommendation, which is that Audit and Governance Committee notes the external auditor's progress to date in delivering their responsibility. Mr. Barber.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry to interject. Are you okay for me just briefly to summarise the other areas of responsibility, just so that the committee's got a full update?
Yes, certainly. That would be very helpful.
Thank you. So just very briefly, so that was the opinion for 2021. Clearly, the other area of responsibility is the value for money conclusion. And just to provide a brief update to members of the committee, that work is well progressed. And I am hopeful that we will be providing officers with a first draft of our auditor's annual report, summarising our VFM views in the next couple of weeks, and that we will be bringing that report through to the next meeting of this committee. So that would be the other element of the 2021 audit. And just in terms of the 21-22 audit, planning continues. And is progressing, and it would also be our intention to bring the audit plan for 21-22, setting out our approach to discharging our responsibilities in both of those areas to the September meeting of this committee. So it's just a brief update on the other areas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber. I take it there aren't any questions on what Mr. Barber just relayed to us. In that case, we'll go back to the recommendation, which is that Audit and Governance Committee notes the external auditor's progress to date in delivering their responsibilities. Am I likely to get the committee to agree to note? Agreed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Barber. And no doubt we can make the arrangements for this further meeting outside of our regular committee meetings, and I'll leave that with officers to communicate with you.
Thank you, Chair.
Very much indeed. Thank you. Now, members, we still have half a dozen items to go through, which are all to be presented by Mr. Stannard. The time is 20:51. Would members like a comfort break before we do that? In which case, can we reconvene in 10 minutes' time at 2100 hours? Thank you, members. Can we now move on, please, to item 12 on the agenda, which is the annual review of declarations of interests, gifts and hospitality by officers 2021-22. And this is for Mr. Stannard, who's the Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd just like to confirm the next 4 reports are sort of pillars to draw upon when you consider the annual governance statement. So this first report is the annual review of declarations of interest, gifts and hospitality. The report's broken down into 2 key sections. The first part is covered in paragraphs 4 to 8, and it's really a reminder to the committee that you've approved an annual evolution of the policy and you agreed some minor changes back in February of each year for the preceding year. Part 2 summarises the work undertaken by internal audit in testing the arrangements and making recommendations to enhance where needed. So just like to draw out a couple of things. So paragraph 11 outlines a new mandatory data matching exercise that was undertaken through the National Fraud Initiative, where staff names and addresses are compared to companies' house directors' names and addresses. A small number of employees, less than 5, were reminded of the need to declare such interests under the policy, even where their companies do not do business with the council. And there was one individual where they did do business with the council, albeit they were a voluntary director. Paragraph 12 then goes into the testing that we did for the have all the officers of the council that are expected to declare interest done so. So we found that 97 out of the 100 senior council officers, and by that we mean tier 4 officers, so that's heads of service and above, have completed and are maintaining their declarations. On a risk basis, of course, these are the officers that are making the key operational decisions, and consequently the public could perceive that those officers are influenced by a conflict if there was not a declaration. I have to admit there is still work to do to ensure wider compliance across lower tiers and grades of staffing, but of course the risks are lower there given that these staff tend not to make the key operational decisions. And as an example of some of the work we're doing, me or my team are going in to areas of the council, to senior leadership teams, to explain why declarations are needed, and they can then be cascaded through staff groups. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Stannard, members, do you have any questions? Councillor Cox.
Just a quickie. I've already asked this question. I can't remember what the answer was. Appreciate this is just for officers, but what about members?
Stannard.
Could I ask Chief Exec or Ms. Seiss what happens with reviewing declarations of interest for
I'll ask the monitoring officer, Ms. Seiss.
Thank you.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. I can answer that question. The Code of Conduct for members requires members to have responsibility for making their own declarations. So there's no particular audit process for them because they are not employees as other staff members would be. But there is a register kept centrally, which Democratic Services keeps on my behalf, and we do send reminders out regularly to members where we think there may be the opportunity for a declaration to be made, but that responsibility will always remain with the member concerned. Thank you, Chair.
I'm surprised there's nobody checking it. I think there should. Personally, I think there should be a checking operation in place. That's just my opinion.
Ms. Seiss, would you like to respond?
I can do, Chairman. Unfortunately, the law doesn't require a check to be made because elected members are representatives of the electorate and have that responsibility on themselves. Obviously, as monitoring officer, should I become aware of the fact that there may be a conflict or a declaration that needs to be made, I will always give a reminder to that member. But unfortunately, the law doesn't require us to do those checks. But the registers are published. They're available on the website. So we do have members of the public from time to time pointing out to us the fact that there might be a declaration missing, and we always follow those up. Thank you, Chairman.
Are there any other questions, members? Can we agree to note the report? Agreed. Thank you. Takes us on to item 13 on the agenda, the use of regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and Investigatory Powers Act Annual Report 2021-22. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. If you don't mind, members, I'm going to use the RIPA and IPA acronym, so I don't have to say what Councillor Beasley's just said then. Best practice suggests that councillors of a suitable committee should review the use of RIPA and IPA at least annually, and in BCP Council that is Audit and Governance. So just to confirm, BCP Council has not used RIPA or IPA powers to conduct covert directed surveillance or to acquire communications data in 2021. The statutory annual report to the ICO was produced and sent off on time. The report further explains and reminds the committee that you've agreed an annual evolution of the policy, and the changes are outlined in paragraphs 4 to 7. Finally, just to confirm that during June 2021, the council was subject to an IPCO inspection, and whilst there were no formal recommendations out of that inspection, the inspector made some observations which have been implemented as summarised at paragraph 9 of the report.
Stannard, members, do you have any questions? There are no questions. Members, can we agree to note the report? Agreed. Thank you very much. Takes us on to item 14 on the agenda, which is the Chief Internal Auditor's Annual Opinion Report 2021-22. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you again, Chair. The public sector internal audit standards require me to formally report annually on the adequacy and effectiveness of the council's internal control environment and offer a formal opinion. However, essentially this report is just a consolidation or a summary of everything that I've reported to you through the year in the quarterly updates and other agenda items. So my core opinion is shown in the executive summary, and simplified, it is that BCP Council has in place an adequate and effective framework of governance, risk management and internal control. Of course, that overall opinion does not mean that there aren't areas of control weaknesses and non-compliance in the council, but internal audit have made recommendations accordingly to correct or improve these issues, and management have agreed in 100% of circumstances, to implement these recs. There have been drawn out various reports through the year to the committee, the level of partial audit opinions, and again these are summarised in paragraph 10 as a reminder for this committee here and now. My report also details how internal audit has to demonstrate compliance with professional standards. That's laid out at paragraphs 34 to 38. If you indulge me a few seconds, Chair, can I take the opportunity to thank my team for their tremendous hard work and their continuous individual commitment to the internal audit profession, to BCP Council, and in upholding the Nolan principles. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. I'm sure every member of this committee, and certainly myself included, would like to endorse the thanks that you've just expressed to your team. Hugely valued, and we I know consistently believe that they do an incredible job with the resources they have allocated to them. So, members, do you have any questions? Councillor Cox.
It's just a quick question in terms of resources. We heard a bit tonight about resource issues in the audit profession, and have you got a full complement? Not how you cover.
We have not got a full complement at the moment. We are one auditor down out of 13, and we have gone to market and failed to recruit through our normal avenues. Therefore, we are using the council's contracted agency, Commensura, and we have literally this week just had a new auditor start through that Commensura contract, so we are up to full complement. We've had a gap of about 3 months in that complement.
So is that a full-time staff or a temporary?
We have decided to employ on a temporary basis just to make sure they're of the quality that we would expect.
Are there any other questions, members? In that case, can we agree to note the report?
Gregory.
Thank you very much. Takes us on to item 15 on the agenda, which is the annual breaches and approved waivers of financial regulations report for 2021-22. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. So before we dig into this report, just hopefully not stating the obvious, but breaches are a bad thing. We don't want to see breaches, and waivers demonstrate good governance and good awareness of the flexibilities afforded to the council's commissioning officers in certain circumstances. I'd just like to ensure the committee, please accept my personal professional assurance that this report is full and frank and nothing's been hidden. So going to the breaches first of all, the explanations and actions arising are detailed in paragraphs 3 and 4 of the report, and I guess you may have some questions on those, which I'll attempt to answer. With regard to the waivers, the table at paragraph 11 summarises the waivers agreed by the CFO's delegated officer, and Appendix 1 details every waiver consolidated by council service area. If a councillor has a specific question about an individual waiver, I may be able to answer it tonight, but obviously holding information of 77 waivers in my head is tricky, so I may have to refer by email, and I'll send an email to the whole committee if a particular councillor has an issue with one. Paragraph 12 explains the link between the limited supplier waiver category and the COVID-19 pandemic. Crudely, the council in certain circumstances and across certain categories of spend has been unable to obtain the necessary or normal number of quotes expected in financial regs. A common scenario, for example, is a company telling us that they have orders far exceeding their current internal capability or supply chain capability, and so they're declining to quote unless the council changes its timescale significantly. So whilst not as acute a problem as 2021, it still existed and in 21-22. So that has had an impact on the number of waivers, but you can see a downward trend there from the peak of the COVID issue. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. Two issues. Firstly, a correction I believe might be needed. I noticed that the BR1 breach was for 200,000 in the box, but in the text in paragraph 4, it's a figure that is incomprehensible because there's an additional naught or 0 that needs to be removed because it's 200,4 noughts. So that's the first point.
Can we so note in the minutes then? Thank you, Councillor Brooke.
And the key point is, if I can get to the figures in your executive summary, it's good to see, as you said, the waivers, although they've increased in number, have decreased significantly in terms of the amount. What is more concerning is the number of, while the number of breaches has decreased, the cost of those breaches has dramatically increased over the 2019-20 figure and significantly over the 2021 figure to now over 1.34 million. So there's a concern there that small number of breaches have obviously been for a significant amount of money. And just one other point, which I don't know what colleagues think, but the 6-month advance payment of £200,000 to, I assume, a single contractor seems an awful lot of money to pay in advance for 6 months' work. I don't know any other officer that's paid that at that rate. What, 400,000 a year?
Mr. Stannard, can you help us on those second and third issues?
Can I take the question about the value of breaches increasing substantially first? So if I take you to paragraph 3 and the table and BR4, what you'll notice is the very considerable element, just over £1 million of the 1.3 million, is associated with coroner's service. Now, you could argue this is a technical breach, and it's hence my comment in the start where I said it's, you know, it's nothing hidden. This is a technical breach in the sense that you can't go to market for a coroner's service. You know, if the coroner's service had done a waiver, it would have been signed off instantly, because, you know, you have to acquire coroners through the appropriate procedures and so on. So you could argue that's a technical breach, and but I didn't want to be accused of not showing the full transparent picture there. So I think that is definitely skewing the number, and hopefully the explanation and the rectification with section 32 procurement notice note, we won't see that again, and therefore without that figure in those numbers, you know, we've got a fairly low breach level, just over 300,000.
The final issue raised by Councillor Brooke.
I suppose Councillor Brooke was making a comment. There wasn't really a question there as such. You know,
I just wondered whether, similar to the previous one, whether there were any, if you like, mitigating circumstances that you could alight on to help us understand it better. But you're shaking your head, so presumably no.
No, thank you.
All right. Councillor Williams.
And Mr. Stannard's just answered my question. Thank you.
Well done. You're ahead of us, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Howell.
Yeah, a comment on the layout of this. One of the descriptions here is did not invite or could not obtain 3 quotes or tenders, which appears quite, like, I would say there's a really significant difference between did not invite, which is not acceptable in many situations because it shows a lack of process, and could not obtain, which is more likely to be a legitimate reason for reaching that outcome. So I think in future it would be helpful if those were separate items, so we could understand where departments are not, because, you know, particularly in transformation here, there's I assume it's transformation in resources. There's some quite big software items there, which one would be surprised and worried if we didn't invite multiple vendors go out to tender. There's also future places consultation document here, which is just a marketing document. I assume it's the which is not the best document in the world, but you know, that's £35,000, I think, that potentially has just gone to a marketing company without it being that, you know, without us asking for quotes from multiple tenderers. So it's you know, it's worrying if we're not going through the proper process, and this document doesn't allow us to see whether we're going through the proper process because of that initial point I raised.
Bernard?
Councillor Howard noted, and will certainly make that change for next year. If I could give you some assurance, however, the did not invite element of that is obviously the CFO's representative explores those factors significantly. And if I could give you an example, it's where it's principally, not exclusively, but principally where an incumbent supplier, such as an IT or software supplier, we've extended the contract for a year pending transformation, for example. So we didn't go out to quote, we just basically spot purchase with the incumbent for that transition period. So those are the did not.
Certainly wouldn't be a case of future places.
But your general point is noted. But you know, members are quite. You can see an individual waiver form, and any of these waivers, if any member wants to look at any in more detail, the paperwork's there. You can see the due diligence that we've been through to sign that off and answering the questions of why it was required. Councillor Howe, if you'd like to see that one for that particular one, I can supply it with.
Yeah, for the future places one, I'd like to see the waiver documentation. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Can we agree to note the report?
Agree.
Thank you very much. Takes on to item 16 on the agenda, which is the annual governance statement 2021-22 and the annual review of the local code of governance. And this is for Mr. Stannard. If necessary, I will ask Mr. Richards to comment. But first of all, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you again, Chair. So the draft AGS before you tonight has been produced as a product of an extensive assurance gathering process, and this is detailed at paragraph 7 in the covering report. Some of these elements are completed at year end, like the completion of the management assurance statements, for example, and other elements are continuous assurance features such as the work of internal audit and the meeting of governance boards such as the Information Governance Board and the Health and Safety Board. So the draft AGS is based on the collective judgment of the Council's wider senior leadership team and endorsed and finalised by the Corporate Management Board. It ultimately reflects the judgment of the Chief Executive and Corporate Directors on the matters which present a significant governance risk to the overall governance framework of BCP Council. And some of those parameters are explained at paragraph 8. Draft AGS forms part of the Statement of Accounts and will therefore be included in the published Public Inspection Period Statement of Accounts bundle, which will commence on the 1st of August 2022, so Monday. The Council will need to reflect on any public comments on the draft AGS before finalising and passing to external audit for consideration within their audit work. So moving into the content of this year's AGS, the draft AGS concludes that BCP Council for the year ending 31st of March 22 has effective fit for purpose governance arrangements in place in accordance with its own governance framework. That said, 3 significant governance issues have been identified where improvements are necessary, and they're identified at paragraph 10 of the accompanying report. For the first 2 issues, namely governance of children's social services and governance arrangements with external bodies, and you'll recall that that includes partnerships, including parks entities, for example, that this committee's had a good chew over. These issues remain on the AGS from last year, and whilst progress has been made to address those governance issues, all issues are not complete, so it would seem premature to remove them from the AGS for 21-22. For the third new issue, the delay in the completion of the 2021 external audit, there are no formal internally focused action plan. There is no formal internal action plan to address this because it's not appropriate. The issue can only be resolved, as we've heard, through the national level, but the external auditors and officers within the council remain committed to doing everything we can to robustly sort that issue. So what next? So subject to this committee's views and the public consultation, there will be a process whereby CMB turn this draft AGS into the final AGS, and this committee will approve that final AGS as part of the statement of accounts sign-off down the line. A&G will then have an update and progress on the implementation of the action plan at its January 2023 meeting, and that's, you will see, is embedded into the forward plan that we look at later. The report also seeks to approve the annual update of the local code of governance, which is shown at Appendix 2, and there's been some marginal updates on that, but nothing material. So over to questions, Chair. Thank you.
Bernard, questions from members. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I'm focusing on paragraph 8 and the criteria acting as a framework for making various judgments. And item B and D seem to me to be of significant interest insofar as an issue has or may result in a need to seek additional funding to allow it to be resolved, or may result in a significant diversion of resources from another service area. Seems to me that the Beach Hut programme falls very nicely into that category, and this attempt to see if the government will bail the council out. And on D, has or may attract significant public interest or may seriously damage the reputation of the council. I think significant damage has already been done when one considers that as a result of a variety of decisions, including the Beach Hut proposal, this council has featured in Rotten Boroughs and Private Eye for 5 consecutive publications. So the damage is already being done, and it's something that we really ought to be very, very concerned about in terms of the decisions that the administration is making. If you want to question, do the officers agree?
Which officer would like to respond?
I suppose we've got Mr. Stannard, Mr. Richards, and the chief executive, all related to the issue, the first issue I raised at least, and I suppose ought to be aware of the second one as well. But no, they needn't answer it. It was just an observation, but if they are prepared to answer, I will be more than happy to.
They're all studiously looking at their laptops at the moment, so I would need to make. Would you like to make a comment, Chief Executive?
I will do. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Councillor, for the opportunity to make the comment. We will reflect on that before publication, and I think we'll have to just consider the position as at, I think Monday it gets published. Draft. Okay.
It's only the draft for public consultation on Monday, so we've had plenty of opportunity to review and change if we see fit.
Yeah, but perhaps I do think it is a valid issue to raise, and as I think I said before, the papers were produced probably 10 days before the meeting. Things have changed over the last few days. We'll reflect on that Monday before we publish the draft and see whether we should make a more up-to-date statement. Fine, thank you.
Members have any other questions? Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I've got two problems really. One is to do with something that Councillor Brooks already raised earlier on, which was to do with the overall governance of the council and the dissembling of overview and scrutiny by the current administration in the last year. And I think this does have a severe effect on the audit and governance of the council, and therefore I think that should be reflected personally. So that's certainly the opinion of myself and a number of others, that the governance of BCP is suffered as a result of decisions made by the administration. The other one is actually in relation to the statement already made by Mr. Gattrell earlier on to do with this particular statement. There was a statement made by him in terms of Section 5 of the Act, and I think the response was that it wasn't material. Well, actually, Section 5 doesn't allow for materiality. If we had a legal breach, and we've had a legal breach, and that's material in itself, just because the numbers are not material from an audit perspective, and that should be reflected. You know, if we're not doing stuff that we should be doing, in terms of Section 5, that should be noted and commented on. So I do not believe that materiality has any bearing on Section 5 whatsoever, and Section 5A, because I did look at it.
If that was a question, Councillor Cox, shall I ask whether Ms Seiss has any comment she'd like to make on that, as contained within the response to Mr Gattrell's question at the start of the meeting? Ms Seiss?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes. So the consideration I took into account when deciding whether or not this matter warranted a Section 5 report was not so much materiality in the accounting sense, but more whether or not the use of a Section 5 report was disproportionate in the circumstances. So a Section 5 report should only really be used for the most significant risks, and also to prevent an unlawful act being taken, or when an unlawful act has already been made or been done. And in these circumstances, there were very minor accounting and administration errors in the data that was published. We were grateful to Mr. Gattrell for pointing these out to us, which we immediately rectified. But I don't believe that any of the other concerns that Mr. Gattrell raised around the format of the data published and the timing of the data published are unlawful under the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Seiss. Councillor Cox?
Just come back on that. I actually happen to disagree with the monitoring officer to say that an illegal act is an illegal act, and therefore that is material in itself, and therefore we should report that. Just for transparency, I appreciate the numbers involved are probably small, but we should, for transparency reasons, we should say that, because if we don't, who's to say who makes the decisions as to what's material?
Ms Seiss?
So again, on the transparency point, I think that has been more than covered by the fact that we immediately republished the correct information. I think there was 10p missing in one column and 20 in another, with a narrative that explained both what had been changed and the reasons why. So I think we have definitely complied with our transparency duty there. And the fact that this matter also has been raised any number of times in open meetings has aired it quite well with councillors as well, I believe, even though I still am not of the view that it warranted a Section 5 report, which is quite a drastic and very little, and should be very little used, intervention by a monitoring officer. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Seiss. Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman. And in direct answer to Councillor Cox's direct question, who makes the judgment? The monitoring officer. That is part of her formal and statutory appointment to the role as monitoring officer. I'm very happy with the monitoring officer's judgment on this. I think it's a sensible judgment. So I think that's where we stand. Any disagreements with that, we're happy to note. The monitoring officer has exercised her judgment.
Thank you, Chief Executive. Are there any other questions on this item? In that case, can we go to the two recommendations? I hope we can take them together. I'll read them out. The first is the draft annual governance statement 2021-22 is agreed prior to the statutory inspection period. And secondly, the annual update of local code of governance is approved. Can we agree those two recommendations? Thank you very much indeed. In that case, I will go to a vote. All right, so all those in favour, please indicate. Those against? So that is agreed, 8 votes to 1. Takes us to the final item on the agenda, which is item 17, which is the forward plan refresh. Members should have a hard copy of a revised forward plan, which has been distributed at the start of this meeting, because there are changes to the dates caused by PERDA. And so what that means is that we have moved the items for those last 2 meetings, given that the meeting that was to be held on the 13th of April will not be taking place, and we've moved items into that meeting and a further previous meeting, which is on the 16th of February. So after the meeting of the 12th of January, we still have 2 meetings, but the dates have had to be changed, and the dates are now the 16th of February and the 16th of March, and those are the dates that are on the council calendar. I don't know, Mr. Stannard, whether you'd like to add anything to that.
No, you've covered that excellently. Thank you, Chair. The only thing that I'd like to add is just the broad as timings require sections. That's the best I could come up with, given the uncertainty that we've heard from the external auditors about when the issues we've talked about would be resolved. So obviously we'll just factor them in at the most appropriate meeting that we can get them to.
Members, you have my word that I will bring that back to you by email if necessary, because obviously we all want to keep on top of this issue. We will give you a refresh subject to any meetings or any further information that comes out. But if it necessitates an additional meeting for any reason, that is what we will have to do. So you'll have to leave that with me and the officers, and we'll do the best we can to progress the matter. Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. Can you refresh my memory, please, on the position with BH Live? Are we still looking at their issues or not? I know it was something that we asked to come back and over a period of time in terms of their governance things. Have we been satisfied and that matter dropped?
I'm going from memory here, so I stand corrected if necessary. That's the caveat at the start. I think what we had agreed was that further to the presentation that we had at Audit and Governance some time ago, I continued to engage between BH Live and the council over specific issues. I think out of COVID and out of all the other related stuff that came with that, that came to a conclusion, and included in my correspondence was the Chief Executive, as well as members of the administration and members of the management, and of course alongside that, management of BH Live, that is, and alongside that, of course, we have councillor representatives, one of whom is Councillor Bartlett, as if you like, an independent member. My recollection, Councillor, is that we were going to come back with a further item at some stage from BH Live, whereby we could rehearse the past but look to the future, and then understand the governance arrangements as they then existed. So that isn't on this forward plan, given that it only goes up until effectively up until March. I would strongly recommend, though, that the successor Audit and Governance Committee after the local elections has that on its forward plan. And I would suggest that it has it on its forward plan within the first 6 months of the new council.
That's good because that matches my recollection of the situation.
Wonderful.
But I wanted to be certain.
No, that's good. That's good.
And my other point is, I did email you some time ago about a whole series of very significant planning issues, and we're just wondering when they're going to come up to, because they go way beyond the bit of work that we did last time.
Yes. Well, we've got. I think they go beyond. And you may correct me on this. Do they go beyond the Constitutional Review Working Group? Or is that something that could be contained there to then be taken back to full council? Or is it a separate item for audit and governance, which may or may not go back to full council?
I would regard it in the first instance as a separate item for audit and governance, because all the issues that I raised are internal governance issues related to how planning is operating.
Okay, so I think...
And it was really also to raise, if you like, quality assurance, how the things that they claim have been introduced, how are they checked and monitored so that we know that things are running properly. You may need to refer back to my email.
Yes, I recall your email, Councillor Brooke. The reason for my hesitation is around the Constitutional Review Working Group. So if we were to include an item for the Audit and Governance Committee, I think we would want to do that before the end of this council, would we not? Which means we've got to find a slot in one of those meetings, probably early in the new year. If I could leave that with officers as to whether we've got a sufficient gap, and I think we might have because of the way we've rejigged this forward plan, then we'll bring that forward at that stage. If there are any items in there which should go to Constitutional Review Working Group, my point there is that we have, I think, because of the timetable, agreed that any items going through that process around the Constitution will need to be at the council meeting on the 8th of November of this year. And that, if you work it back, means that it's got to come to Audit and Governance by for the meeting on the 27th of October of this year. So time starts to get very, very tight. But if it's a general paper and presentation, we're not constrained by that. We can do it in the spring.
Yeah, I don't think from the issues that are involved that it is actually a constitutional. I don't think they're constitutional issues per se. Almost certainly, but it's to do with internal governance of planning itself.
Very well, we'll ask officers to try and slot in an item there by engagement with the head of planning at the same time. So if Mr. Hampton, you could note that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Councillor Phipps.
Just quickly, parks. We did parks and we had presentation and everything, and I think the monitoring officer or somebody was going away to do a report and look into everything, and I thought that was coming back. Am I right or wrong, or it's not on there? That's all.
I think it was in similar vein to my response to the BH Live issue, albeit that there wasn't that interim period and additional work. So I think, again, it was a question of bringing it back, if you like, a little bit later. So that may well be, that may well miss the deadline of the last meeting in the spring. You're frowning at me, Councillor Phipps.
It just seems to have taken quite a long time. So we had this a long time ago in the presentation. So it's probably going to be by the time, if it doesn't come in before like elections or whatever, it's going to be well over a year, isn't it?
Well, again, could I ask Mr. Hampton and the officers to look at what the position actually is on that, perhaps by talking to the service director about the timeliness of bringing it to us. And you know me, if we can, we will. Councillor Howe.
Yes, has this committee looked at the impact of locum temporary agency staff on the performance levels essentially, and whether excessive use of them actually gets us into a cycle of poor quality and failing to serve the public properly.
Well, as I said at the start of the meeting, if there are any additional items to be considered to go onto our forward plan, and the two that have been raised are not additional, they're just continuity items, yeah. that would be a new item. Then those need to be expressed in email to me, please, so that we can see whether that's whether that is appropriate.
I take it from that it hasn't been discussed.
It hasn't been specifically. I think if it were, it sort of got the feel to me of a new council item, an item that should be with audit and governance in that first year after the next elections. I think I'd prefer to be seeing the time that we've got, which is limited, to mopping up issues which are work in progress, if you like, already. That's not to say it's not important, but I do think it's much more a new council issue than it is the old council. And I think we'll struggle to get many new items actually into the agenda, because there won't be the scope for additional meetings, because we've already got additional meetings in the programme. So members, if there are no other questions, can we agree to note the revised forward plan subject to the amendments that I've just set out? Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for your forbearance, your stamina this evening. I hope you've had an enjoyable meeting. Thank you to any members of the public who remain with us, and of course a thank you to the officers for seeing the process through with us this evening, both here and online. And I close the meeting at 21:49. Thank you for attending.